There is a line running through the island of Britain that most people never notice. It does not appear on modern maps. It is not marked by a fence or a road or a river, but geneticists know it is there. Archaeologists have mapped its edges for decades, and the people who live on either side of it have felt it in ways they could not always explain. On one side of that line, you have England. On the other side, you have Wales. And the difference between them is not merely a matter of language or landscape or politics. It is something older than all of those things. Something written in blood and bone that has been accumulating for thousands of years before anyone thought to give these places names at all. What you are about to hear is not the version taught in school. It is not the tidy narrative of Romans and Normans and Plantagenet kings that most people absorb without questioning. It is the deeper story, the one that begins before the island even had a name, the one that explains why two populations living less than 50 miles apart in some places can look so profoundly, measurably different from each other, why the Welsh language carries sounds and structures that have no parallel anywhere else in the world outside of a handful of other fringe Atlantic communities, why the genetic signal found in certain Welsh valleys is more closely related to ancient Iberian populations than to the people living in London or Birmingham or the East Midlands. This is not speculation. This is documented. This is peer-reviewed. This is written in the genomes of living people who simply went about their lives not knowing they were carrying one of the most remarkable stories in European prehistory inside their own cells. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. The story begins somewhere around 12,000 years ago. The ice was leaving. It had been sitting on most of northern Europe for the better part of 100,000 years, grinding the landscape flat in some places and carving it into impossible shapes in others. As it retreated northward, it left behind a world that was wet and raw and empty in the way that only recently deglaciated land can be empty. The soil was thin. The vegetation was tentative. The rivers ran grey with glacial meltwater that had nowhere particular to go. And into this emptied landscape, following the retreating cold northward along the edges of the continent, came people. They had been waiting, not consciously, not with any plan, but biologically and geographically they had been pressed into refugia during the worst of the cold, southern France, the Iberian Peninsula, perhaps the edges of what is now Italy and the Balkans. These were the places where the ice had not reached, where the tundra gave way to something more survivable, where the populations of anatomically modern humans who had arrived in Europe 40 or 50,000 years earlier had spent the glacial maximum in compressed, isolated pockets, slowly diverging from each other in small but measurable ways. When the ice retreated and the land opened again, those refugial populations moved. And the movement that matters for this story, the one that carries the deepest consequences for everything that would eventually become Wales, was the movement northward from the Atlantic coast of Iberia. These were not farmers. They had no grain, no domesticated animals, no permanent settlements. They were hunter-gatherers. They were the people geneticists now call Western hunter-gatherers, or WHG for short, and they were extraordinarily old in terms of the European genetic landscape. Their ancestry traced back through the glacial maximum to populations that had been in Europe for tens of thousands of years before agriculture was even a concept anywhere on the planet. They moved north along the Atlantic coast because the Atlantic coast was the most productive route. The ocean was different then. Sea levels were much lower, which meant there was more land. The western coast of France and the northern coast of Iberia were connected by stretches of exposed continental shelf that are now underwater. The Irish Sea was smaller, and parts of what would become Wales were accessible from the coast in ways that would not survive the post-glacial sea level rise. These early post-glacial migrants followed the coast because the coast fed them, shellfish and seabirds and marine mammals, and the fish that ran in the rivers draining into the Atlantic. They moved northward, not because they had a destination in mind, but because the resources kept extending in that direction as the climate warmed and the land became more hospitable. By around 9 or 10,000 years ago, their descendants were in what is now Wales. We know this because we have found them, not their writings, which did not exist, not their buildings, which were temporary and organic and have not survived, but their bones have survived in caves and from those bones we have been able to extract DNA that tells a story about who these people were and how they relate to modern populations. And the story that DNA tells about Wales is extraordinary. The Western hunter-gatherer signal, the genetic signature of those post-glacial Atlantic coast migrants, is significantly higher in Wales than it is in most of England. This is not a subtle difference. It is measurable and consistent across multiple studies conducted by multiple independent research teams over the past decade. The implications of that single fact are profound, and they require some unpacking before you can fully appreciate what they mean. Because they do not mean what most people assume they mean when they first hear it. Most people, when they think about the populations of ancient Britain, imagine a kind of sequential replacement. First, there were hunter-gatherers. Then farmers arrived and replaced them. Then Bronze Age people arrived and replaced the farmers. Then Iron Age people arrived. Then Romans. Then Saxons. Then Normans. And so on, each wave washing over the previous one and leaving something new on the shore. That model is wrong. Not entirely wrong, because migrations did happen and populations did shift. But the idea that each migration was a clean replacement, that the people who came before were simply swept away, is demonstrably false. What actually happened was messier and more interesting and more consequential. When the first farmers arrived in Britain around 6,000 years ago, they came from the Near East via the continent. They were genetically quite different from the hunter-gatherers already living in Britain. They had a different ancestry profile, reflecting their ultimate origins in Anatolia and the Fertile Crescent, where agriculture had first developed. And they did spread across Britain, there is no question about that. Their genetic signal shows up in ancient DNA from sites all across the island. But they did not replace the hunter-gatherers completely. The hunter-gatherers contributed to the gene pool of the farming populations in ways that varied significantly by region. And in some parts of Britain, particularly in the far west and in Wales specifically, the hunter-gatherer contribution was substantially higher than elsewhere. Why? The answer involves geography, ecology, and the simple mathematics of population density in difficult terrain. The landscape of Wales is not easy. Anyone who has driven through it or walked through it knows this in their bones. It is mountainous and wet and heavily dissected by rivers and valleys. It is a landscape that rewards deep knowledge and punishes strangers. The farming culture that spread across Britain during the Neolithic period was adapted to specific kinds of land. It needed river valleys and floodplains and the kind of relatively level agricultural land where you could establish fields and maintain herds with some predictability. Much of Wales did not offer that in any abundance. The Cambrian Mountains in the centre of the country, the Brecon Beacons in the south, the ranges of Snowdonia in the north, these were not prime agricultural territory. They were hunting and gathering territory. And the people who had been living in them and from them for thousands of years had a profound advantage over newly arriving farmers who did not know the land. They knew where the game moved. They knew which plants grew where and when. They knew the caves and the shelters and the routes through the high ground. They were, in a very practical sense, better suited to surviving in this particular landscape than anyone who had just arrived from the continent with a set of agricultural techniques optimized for different terrain. So what happened was not replacement. What happened was coexistence and gradual integration, with the balance tipping differently in different parts of the island. In the more fertile and accessible parts of what would become England, the incoming farmers were numerous enough and productive enough to establish population density that progressively shifted the genetic balance toward their ancestry profile. In Wales, the terrain limited that process. The hunter-gatherers of the Welsh uplands were not simply absorbed. They contributed, persistently and in large quantities, to the population that eventually settled into what we recognize as the ancestral Welsh gene pool. And that contribution is still detectable today, 12,000 years after the last of the ice retreated, and those original post-glacial migrants first followed the Atlantic coast northward into an empty and newly habitable land. But the Western hunter-gatherer component is only the first layer of this story. The second layer is even more revealing, and it requires understanding what happened during the Bronze Age. Around 4,500 years ago, a population explosion of extraordinary magnitude took place on the Eurasian steppe, the vast grassland territory stretching from what is now Ukraine and Russia eastward across Central Asia. The people who initiated this expansion are known to archaeologists and geneticists as the Yamnaya culture, and the genetic signal associated with them is sometimes called steppe ancestry. They were pastoralists. They herded cattle and sheep and horses. They were mobile in ways that sedentary farming communities were not, and for reasons that are still being studied and debated, they expanded westward into Europe with extraordinary speed and replaced, in some cases almost completely, the farming populations that had established themselves there during the preceding 2,000 years. The Bell Beaker archaeological culture, which spread across much of Western Europe during this period, was associated with this migration and with a dramatic genetic shift. In the British Isles specifically, the genetic turnover associated with the Bell Beaker expansion was remarkable. In England, the steppe ancestry that arrived with Bell Beaker people replaced the Neolithic farmer ancestry to a degree that approaches 90% in some studies. What that means in practice is that the people living in what would become England after the Bronze Age transition were almost entirely descended from these incoming steppe-associated populations, with only trace amounts of the Neolithic farmer ancestry and even smaller traces of the original Mesolithic hunter-gatherer signal surviving. In Wales, the picture was different. The steppe ancestry arrived. There is no question about that. The Bell Beaker expansion reached the western extremities of Britain, but the degree of replacement was not the same. The Welsh Highlands again acted as a partial barrier. The terrain that had limited the initial farming expansion also limited, to some degree, the Bell Beaker expansion. The steppe ancestry signal in Wales is lower than in England. The Neolithic farmer ancestry component is higher, and beneath both of those layers, the ancient western hunter-gatherer signal, the ghost of those first post-glacial Atlantic coast migrants, is more prominent than in almost any other population in Britain. These are not separate stories. They are different chapters of the same story, and the story is about a landscape that protected its inhabitants from complete demographic replacement in a way that the more accessible lowland terrain to the east simply could not. Each successive wave of migration that swept across Britain hit the Welsh uplands and was absorbed differently, incompletely, layered onto what was already there, rather than replacing it wholesale. The result, accumulated over 12,000 years, is a genetic profile that is genuinely, measurably distinct from the English one. The People of the British Isles study, published in the journal Nature in 2015, was one of the most comprehensive genetic surveys of Britain ever conducted. The research team collected DNA samples from over 2,000 people who had all four grandparents born within 80 kilometres of each other in a rural part of Britain, which effectively meant they were sampling populations that had been geographically stable for at least several generations. What they found was that Britain is not genetically uniform. It is a patchwork of distinct regional populations whose genetic boundaries correspond remarkably closely to historical, political, and cultural divisions. The Welsh clusters in that study were among the most distinct in the entire British sample. They showed greater separation from the English clusters than almost any other British regional group, with the partial exception of the Orkney Islanders who have their own unique history of Norse settlement. The Welsh distinctiveness was not explained by recent geography alone. It was not simply that Welsh people had been living in Wales for a few centuries and had therefore diverged slightly from their English neighbours through isolation. The genetic signal in Welsh populations traced back to genuinely ancient ancestry that predated any historical period most people would recognise as relevant to modern British identity. It traced back to the post-glacial migrations and the Neolithic and the Bronze Age, all three of those ancient layers present in proportions that were different from those found in England. And those different proportions produce measurable differences in the physical characteristics that express from that genetic background. The physical distinctiveness of Welsh populations has been noticed and remarked upon by observers for as long as observers have been writing about Britain. Roman writers commented on the appearance of the peoples of the western parts of the island. Medieval writers made distinctions. Early modern travellers and ethnographers noted characteristics that seemed to cluster differently in Wales than in England. Some of these observations were wrapped in the political and cultural assumptions of their time and need to be read carefully. But the core observation, that there is something physically different about the Welsh population in aggregate, is not simply a product of nationalism or wishful thinking. It corresponds to something real. The Welsh population shows elevated frequencies of dark hair combined with pale skin, a combination that shows up in the anthropological literature under various names, but which reflects a specific genetic architecture inherited from the Western hunter-gatherer founding population. The ancient genomes of Western hunter-gatherers, recovered from sites across Europe, show high frequencies of variants associated with dark or brown hair, and simultaneously high frequencies of variants associated with pale or very pale skin. This combination, which can seem counterintuitive given the way we often think about pigmentation genetics, is actually explained by the specific allelic composition of the WHG population and by the fact that skin pigmentation and hair pigmentation are controlled by different genetic pathways. The steppe populations who arrived with the Bell-Beaker expansion had a somewhat different pigmentation profile, and the Neolithic farmers before them had yet another configuration. When these ancestry components are present in different proportions, the resulting population-level physical characteristics shift accordingly. In Wales, with its higher WHG ancestry component and its lower relative steppe ancestry compared to England, the WHG pigmentation signature is more prominently expressed across the population. Dark hair on pale skin, a slightly different facial structure that reflects the ancient craniometric profile of Western hunter-gatherers. These are real signals in real data, not invented distinctions. There is a specific genetic variant worth understanding here because it illuminates the connection between Wales and the wider Atlantic world in a way that most people have never heard explained. The red hair associated with some Welsh individuals, and with many Irish and Scottish ones, comes from variants in the MC1R gene. The highest global frequencies of these MC1R loss-of-function variants are found in precisely the regions that show the highest Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. Ireland has the highest frequency in the world. Scotland is close behind. Wales is elevated compared to England. The pattern maps onto the WHG ancestry gradient almost perfectly. Red hair in the Atlantic fringe is not a random mutation that appeared recently. It is a trait that was present in the Western hunter-gatherer population itself, as confirmed by ancient DNA studies showing high MC1R variant frequencies in Mesolithic European genomes. Cheddar Man, the roughly 10,000-year-old individual found in a Somerset cave and whose genome was sequenced in 2018, showed high probability of dark to black hair and blue eyes, with high probability of having been a carrier of MC1R variants associated with red hair in some genetic backgrounds. He was a Western hunter-gatherer. He was the kind of person whose descendants would become the founding population of prehistoric Wales. And the variants that produce red hair in a subset of his descendants are still circulating in the Welsh, Irish, and Scottish gene pools, at frequencies that reflect the relative preservation of WHG ancestry in those Atlantic coastal populations. When you see a red-haired Welsh person, you are looking at a physical expression of an evolutionary history that stretches back at least 10,000 years and possibly further. You are looking at a fragment of the original European genetic landscape before the farming revolution, before the steppe expansion, before any of the migrations that most people associate with British prehistory even began. The eye colour patterns in Welsh populations tell a similar story, though a more complicated one. The variants associated with blue and grey-green eyes, particularly those in the OCA2 and HERC2 regions of chromosome 15, show complex distributions across European populations that reflect both the ancient WHG ancestry and subsequent admixture patterns. Welsh populations show elevated frequencies of certain eye colour variants compared to the English average, though the picture is complicated by the multiple population layers and the ongoing genetic mixing of the past several centuries. What is clearer is the skin pigmentation architecture. The variants in SLC2, 4A5 and SLC45A2, the two genes most strongly associated with pale skin pigmentation in European populations, appear to have been selected for under the low ultraviolet conditions of Northern Europe. But the selection happened at different times and in different ancestral populations. Some variants were present in the WHG population. Others came with the Neolithic farmers. The steppe populations also contributed some pigmentation variants. The specific combination and frequency of these variants in Welsh populations reflects the particular proportions of those ancestral components, and those proportions produce, on average across the population, a characteristic skin quality that observers from outside have consistently noted. None of this is about ranking populations or claiming any hierarchy of value. The point is not that Welsh people are somehow more original or more authentic than English people. It is simply that the history of human migration and admixture across Britain has proceeded differently in different parts of the island, and the Welsh landscape has functioned as a partial demographic preservative in a way that the English lowlands have not. The consequence of that preservation is that the modern Welsh population carries a higher proportion of ancient ancestry layers that elsewhere in Britain were diluted or overwhelmed by successive waves of migration. That higher proportion expresses itself in measurable genetic differences and in the physical characteristics that emerge from those genetic differences. It is a story about geography as much as it is about people, because the mountains made the difference. The mountains were there before any of the people arrived, and the mountains shaped which people stayed and in what proportions. The language of Wales, Welsh, or Cymraeg, as its speakers call it, is the most visible and audible expression of this deep distinctiveness. And understanding the true history of the Welsh language is essential to understanding why the Welsh and English look different, because the linguistic history and the genetic history are not separate phenomena. They are expressions of the same underlying story about differential migration, differential replacement, and the preservation of ancient populations in the Atlantic fringe. Welsh belongs to the Brittonic branch of the Celtic language family, which also includes Cornish and Breton. It is a P-Celtic language, meaning that where Goidelic languages like Irish and Scottish Gaelic use a Q sound, Brittonic languages use a P sound. This linguistic distinction traces back to divergence that happened during the Iron Age, or possibly earlier, as the Celtic languages spoken across much of prehistoric Europe began to differentiate into regional variants. What matters here is not the internal classification of Celtic, but the relationship between Celtic languages and what came before them in Britain. Because Celtic was not always the language of Britain. There were languages in Britain before Celtic arrived, or before Celtic developed out of earlier Bronze Age languages spoken in the region. The place name Evidence and the river name Evidence make this clear. Some of the river names in Britain are so ancient that they predate any reconstructible Indo-European route. The Thames, the Exe, the Avon, the Wye. These names come from a stratum of language so old that linguists can only analyze them in fragments, comparing them to similar ancient names elsewhere in Atlantic Europe and noting the connections without being able to fully reconstruct the language system that produced them. The Welsh language, when it arrived or when it developed from whatever was spoken in Britain before it, absorbed this ancient substrate. It carries sounds and structural features that set it apart not just from English but from most of the world's languages. The mutation system in Welsh, the way that word initial consonants change depending on grammatical context, is a feature that strikes speakers of most other languages as strange and counterintuitive, but which makes perfect sense within the phonological logic of the language. The vocabulary contains ancient elements, words for landscape features and agricultural practices and body parts and kinship relationships that trace their roots to the Proto-Celtic stage and in some cases to earlier Indo-European or even pre-Indo-European. Strata. The language is a palimpsest, a document written over and over by successive layers of speakers, each adding their contribution without fully erasing what was there before. When the Romans arrived in Britain in 43 CE, under the Emperor Claudius, they encountered a complex mosaic of Iron Age tribal societies across the island. The tribes of what would become Wales were not a single unified entity. They were distinct groups with distinct territories and distinct political structures. The Silures occupied the southeast, the Ordovices held the north, the Demetae were in the southwest, the Disangli in the northeast. Each of these groups had its own local leadership, its own social hierarchy, its own particular relationship with the landscape it inhabited. What they shared was a broadly similar cultural framework, reflecting the Iron Age Celtic cultural package that had spread across Britain over the preceding centuries, and a deeply rooted knowledge of their own specific terrain that would prove extraordinarily difficult for Roman military power to neutralize. The Romans made repeated attempts to conquer what they called Cambria, but the conquest of the Welsh Highlands was never as complete or as durable as the conquest of the English lowlands. The legionary fortress at Isca Sillarum, modern Caerleon in South Wales, was established after sustained and costly campaigning against the Ciliars, a tribe that the Roman writer Tacitus described as having dark complexions and curly hair, which led him to speculate about a possible Iberian origin. The Iberian comparison is interesting in retrospect, given what we now know about the shared Western hunter-gatherer ancestry connecting Atlantic populations from the Iberian Peninsula to Britain. Tacitus was observing something real in the physical appearance of the Silures that distinguished them from other populations the Romans had encountered, and his instinctive comparison to Iberian people reflects a genuine underlying genetic connection, even if he had no framework for understanding what that connection was. The Silures fought the Romans for decades. They developed a guerrilla warfare adaptation that negated many of the advantages of Roman military technology and formation tactics. The landscape they fought in was their landscape, understood at a level that the Roman forces could never match. Eventually, Rome established a degree of control, but the military presence required to maintain even partial control over the Welsh Highlands was substantial and expensive. The frontier forts and signal stations and road networks that Rome built across Wales represent an enormous investment of resources, and they required constant garrisoning because the populations they were meant to control never fully accepted Roman authority in the way that lowland British tribes did. The Romanization of Wales was thin and uneven. In the south, near the coasts, and in the more accessible river valleys, Roman culture left a deeper mark. In the uplands, Roman material culture shows up only superficially in the archaeological record. The people living in the high valleys continued their Iron Age way of life with relatively little disruption, maintaining their language, their social structures, their pastoral economy, and their dense local knowledge of the landscape. When Rome withdrew in the early 5th century, the populations of the Welsh Highlands had less Roman cultural overlay to shed than the populations of the English lowlands. They had been changed less, and they had preserved more of what they were before Rome arrived. The period after Roman withdrawal is one of the most consequential in the entire history of Britain, and it is largely responsible for the divergence between Wales and England that is still visible today, both genetically and culturally and linguistically. In England, the post-Roman period saw the arrival of Anglo-Saxon settlers from northern continental Europe, from the regions we now call the Netherlands and northwestern Germany and southern Denmark. These were Germanic-speaking peoples, and their arrival in Britain is one of the most studied and debated episodes in British history. The question of how many of them came and how thoroughly they replaced or mixed with the existing population has been argued for a long time, and the answer has shifted significantly in recent decades as ancient DNA evidence has become available. What the DNA evidence shows is that the Anglo-Saxon migration was substantial and that it produced a significant genetic shift in what would become England. The steppe ancestry that had already arrived with the Bell-Beaker expansion was reinforced and supplemented by additional steppe-related ancestry from the continental Germanic populations. The existing Romano-British population was not entirely replaced, but the genetic balance shifted dramatically in a relatively short period, probably between the mid-5th century and the late 7th century. The Germanic ancestry fraction in modern English populations from the eastern and central parts of England is far higher than most people would have expected before the ancient DNA evidence was available. Some studies suggest that 40 to 60% or more of the ancestry of people from parts of eastern England traces to these post-Roman continental migrations. The language shift was equally dramatic. Old English, the Germanic language that would eventually become modern English after its own subsequent mixing with Norse and Norman French, replaced the Brittonic Celtic languages spoken by the Romano-British population across most of what is now England in a matter of 2 or 3 centuries. The speed and thoroughness of that language replacement is striking and suggests that the social and demographic weight of the incoming population was substantial. What happened in Wales was different. The Welsh Highlands were not attractive to Anglo-Saxon settlers in the way that the fertile lowlands of England were. The terrain was wrong. The agricultural potential was lower. The existing population was dense and organized and resistant. Anglo-Saxon expansion westward pressed against the Welsh populations but did not significantly penetrate the uplands. The boundary between Anglo-Saxon settlement and Welsh territory stabilized along a line that was eventually formalized in the late 8th century, when the Mercian king Offa built the dyke that still bears his name. Offa's dyke is one of the most remarkable engineering works of early medieval Britain. A linear earthwork running roughly from the Dee estuary in the north to the Severn estuary in the south, marking the western boundary of Mercian territory and, effectively, the eastern boundary of what remained culturally and politically Welsh. The dyke did not appear out of nowhere. It formalized a frontier that had been hardening for a century or more as Anglo-Saxon expansion westward ran into the resistance of Welsh kingdoms. And those Welsh kingdoms, with their Brittonic Celtic language and their royal genealogies and their ecclesiastical traditions and their dense local cultural knowledge, maintained an independence that no English political entity ever fully extinguished until the Acts of Union in the 16th century, and even then the extinction was legal and political rather than cultural. The genetic consequence of this historical divergence is exactly what you would expect. While the Anglo-Saxon migration was transforming the genetic profile of what would become England, the Welsh population was not participating in that transformation. The Germanic ancestry that was flowing into England from the continent was not flowing into Wales in any comparable volume. The Welsh population continued along its own genetic trajectory, accumulating slight changes from internal mixing and from whatever degree of contact occurred along the border, but fundamentally maintaining the pre-Saxon British genetic profile. And that pre-Saxon British genetic profile was, as we have established, itself the product of thousands of years of differential preservation of ancient layers, the WHG ancestry, the Neolithic farmer ancestry, the Bronze Age steppe ancestry, all present in proportions that reflected the particular history of demographic mixing and preservation in the Welsh landscape. When researchers compare the genetic profiles of modern Welsh and modern English populations from eastern England, what they are seeing is the cumulative product of all of these historical differences stacked on top of each other. The original post-glacial difference in WHG ancestry proportions, the difference in how completely the Neolithic farming expansion replaced the original hunter-gatherers, the difference in Bell-Beaker steppe ancestry penetration, and then, on top of all of that, the massive additional layer of Anglo-Saxon Germanic ancestry that entered England but not Wales. Each of these layers pushed the populations further apart. Each one added to the divergence that had begun as soon as the post-glacial migrants first moved into the mountains of western Britain and found a landscape that would protect them from subsequent demographic waves more effectively than the lowlands to the east. The Viking Age added another layer of complexity to the story without fundamentally changing the underlying dynamic. Norse settlers arrived in Britain from the late 8th century onward, and their impact on the genetic landscape was significant but geographically specific. In parts of northern England, in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire and Cumbria, the Norse genetic contribution was substantial. In Ireland and Scotland, particularly in the northern and western islands, Norse settlement left a very strong genetic mark. In Wales, the Norse impact was more limited. There was Norse activity along the Welsh coast. The place name evidence shows that Norse-speaking seafarers were present and, in some cases, established small settlements in coastal areas. But the Welsh interior was not settled by Norse populations in any significant numbers. The coastal Norse activity left some genetic traces, particularly in Pembrokeshire in the southwest, which has long been known to antiquarians as Little England, beyond Wales, because of its distinct cultural history and its long-standing English and Norse connections. But across the majority of Wales, the Norse genetic contribution was small. The Viking Age reinforced the pattern that had been established by the Anglo-Saxon period, and before it by the Bronze Age, and before that by the Neolithic. Each successive migration that reshaped the genetics of lowland Britain had less impact in Wales than elsewhere. The accumulated result was a gene pool that by the high medieval period was genuinely and substantially distinct from the English one. And it remained that way through the medieval period and into the early modern period, because the social and geographic barriers that had produced the genetic distinctiveness in the first place did not disappear when Wales was politically incorporated into the English state. The Norman conquest of 1066 changed England's ruling class entirely and introduced significant admixture from the French-speaking Norse-descended population that had established itself in Normandy over the preceding century and a half. Normans moved into Wales too, establishing castles and lordships in the lowlands and border territories. But the conquest of Wales was protracted and incomplete in a way that the conquest of England was not. Norman lords held the March, the borderland, but the native Welsh kingdoms of Gwynedd and Deheubarth and Powys maintained their independence for centuries. The native Welsh dynasties continued to rule in the uplands. The language continued to be spoken. The culture continued to develop according to its own internal logic. The genetic mixing that occurred between Welsh and Norman populations was real, but geographically concentrated along the border and in the areas of Norman lordship in the south. The upland heartland of Wales, the areas that had been most thoroughly shaped by the ancient demographic history, remained largely outside the zone of significant Norman genetic admixture. The result was that even as the political map of Britain was transformed by the Norman conquest, the genetic map of Welsh upland communities remained more continuous with the deep past than almost anywhere else in Britain. The medieval Welsh bardic tradition, one of the great continuous literary cultures of medieval Europe, was maintained by professional hereditary poets who composed in a linguistic tradition stretching back to the 6th century and probably further. Those poets were serving a society that understood itself to have ancient roots, a society whose relationship with its own landscape was expressed through a dense web of place, name, law, and mythological association and legal custom that encoded thousands of years of accumulated local knowledge. The great Welsh mythological collection, the Mabinogion, preserves stories whose structural roots appear to stretch back to the pre-Christian Iron Age and possibly earlier. The landscape described in those stories is recognizably the Welsh landscape, the same mountains and rivers and coasts that shaped the genetic history we have been tracing. The culture and the genetics are not separate things. They develop together, each reinforcing the other, in the context of a landscape that consistently protected both from the complete replacement or dilution that occurred elsewhere. The Acts of Union of 1536 and 1543, passed under Henry VIII, legally incorporated Wales into the English state and imposed English as the language of law and administration in Wales. The impact on the Welsh language was severe in institutional terms. Welsh was excluded from the law courts. Welsh speakers were barred from holding public office unless they were English-speaking. The language was pushed out of the domains of power and prestige and was left with the domains of home and community and religious practice. And yet it survived. The survival of Welsh through 4 centuries of official suppression and marginalization is remarkable and reflects the same deep-rootedness that the genetic evidence shows. The people who spoke Welsh were not a recent linguistic community that could be easily displaced by administrative pressure. They were a community whose language was embedded in their landscape, in the names of every stream and hill and field, in their religious practice, in their family structures, in their economic life as pastoral farmers, in a terrain that the English administrative apparatus could regulate, but not fundamentally transform. The Welsh mountains continued to produce the same kind of people they had always produced, people who knew the land in the intimate way that only many generations of living in a specific place can produce. And that knowledge, encoded in the language and the culture, was a form of resistance to displacement that no act of parliament could simply legislate away. The Industrial Revolution added a new dimension to the Welsh story by transforming the South Wales valleys into one of the most industrialized and densely populated regions in the world within the space of a few generations. The coalfields of Glamorgan and Monmouthshire attracted hundreds of thousands of migrants from across Britain and Ireland and further afield. The genetic composition of the South Wales valleys changed substantially during this period, diluted by admixture from the incoming populations in a way that the North and Mid-Wales uplands were not. The industrial transformation created the interesting situation that still exists today, where the most demographically and genetically Welsh populations, in the sense of closest to the pre-industrial baseline, are found in the rural Welsh-speaking heartland, the Fro Gymreg, while the more densely populated South Wales Valley communities are genetically more mixed, reflecting their industrial-era migration history. This distinction within Wales is important for interpreting any modern genetic data on the Welsh population, because the signal you find depends enormously on where in Wales you are sampling. A study that oversamples the Cardiff area or the Swansea Bay coastal zone will find a more mixed genetic profile than a study that samples from Gwynedd or Ceredigion or Powys. The people of the British Isles study dealt with this by sampling only from rural areas with four-generation residential stability, which effectively directed its sampling toward the most historically stable Welsh communities. And it was in those communities that the most distinctive Welsh genetic signature was found. The story of Welsh blood type distributions adds another angle to this picture that most people are not aware of. Blood type genetics are relatively simple and have been studied for over a century, which means we have good population-level data from many countries and regions. The ABO blood group distribution in Wales differs from the English one in ways that have attracted attention from researchers and that reflect, at least in part, the different genetic history of the two populations. Wales shows somewhat elevated frequencies of blood type O compared to the English average, a pattern that is shared with Ireland and Scotland and other Atlantic fringe populations. Blood type O is associated with Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in the research literature, and its elevated frequency in the Atlantic fringe populations is consistent with the higher WHG ancestry signal those populations show in genome-wide studies. Blood type A is slightly lower in Wales than in much of England, a difference that has been noted in the clinical literature because it has practical implications for blood supply planning. The Rh-negative blood type frequency is also elevated in Wales compared to the English population. Rh-negative reaches its highest frequencies globally in the Basque region of Spain and France, and it is elevated across the Atlantic fringe populations generally, again consistent with the pattern of higher WHG and older Atlantic ancestry in those populations. None of these blood type differences are dramatic in isolation. They are statistical patterns at the population level, not individual predictors. But they reinforce, from an entirely independent line of evidence, the picture that emerges from the genome-wide studies. The Welsh population is different from the English one in ways that reflect thousands of years of different demographic history, and that difference shows up whether you are looking at the fine-grained variation of genome-wide SMP data or the simpler polymorphisms of ABO and Rh blood typing. The connection between Wales and the Basque Country is worth examining in more detail because it is one of the most striking and least publicised aspects of the genetics of the British Isles. The Basque people of northern Spain and southern France are famous among linguists and geneticists alike for being an outlier population. Their language, Euskara, has no proven relationship to any other language on Earth. It is a language isolate, in the most complete sense, surrounded on all sides by Indo-European languages that swept across Europe over the past few thousand years and absorbed or displaced every other language they encountered, but which left Euskara untouched in its mountain homeland in the Pyrenees. The reason Euskara survived while every other pre-Indo-European language of Western Europe disappeared is the same reason the Welsh Highlands preserved their population's genetic distinctiveness. The Basque Country is mountainous, the terrain is difficult, and the population that had established itself there during the post-glacial period had the deep landscape knowledge and the demographic density to resist linguistic and demographic displacement more effectively than populations in more accessible areas. The genetic profile of the Basque people shows extraordinarily high Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, among the highest of any population in Europe. Their genetic isolation has been confirmed by multiple studies, which show that the Basque population has been genetically relatively stable for several thousand years, with much lower admixture from the farming and steppe expansions than neighbouring Iberian or French populations. And here is the connection. The same high WHG ancestry signal that characterises the Basques is found at elevated levels in Wales and Ireland and Scotland and other Atlantic fringe populations. These populations are not closely related in a simple genealogical sense, but they are connected by shared ancestry. They are all the inheritors, in different proportions, of the same post-glacial Atlantic coast migration that brought Western hunter-gatherers northward from their glacial refugia along the Atlantic coast of Iberia. The Basques represent the southern end of that migration and have been most thoroughly preserved by their mountain homeland. The Welsh, Irish, and Scots represent the northern end of the same migration, preserved by their own highlands and by the sea barriers of the Atlantic fringe. The Y chromosome haplogroup R1b, which is the most common male lineage in Western Europe, reaches very high frequencies in all of these populations. But more specifically, the subclade R1b, L21, sometimes called the Atlantic modal haplotype, which appears to have originated and diversified in the British Isles and surrounding Atlantic area several thousand years ago, is particularly common in Wales and Ireland and Scotland. This specific lineage reflects the Bell Beaker expansion of Bronze Age people into the Atlantic fringe, but it diversified most extensively in the British Isles themselves, suggesting that the people who carry it have been in the Atlantic fringe for a very long time, mixing with and partially absorbing the even older WHG population rather than simply replacing it. The mitochondrial DNA evidence, which traces female lineages, tells a complementary story. Haplogroup H, the most common mitochondrial lineage in Western Europe, shows subtle regional variations across the British Isles that reflect the complex demographic history of the different regions. Haplogroup U5 and its subclades, particularly U5b, are mitochondrial lineages that were characteristic of Western hunter-gatherers and that survive at elevated frequencies in Atlantic fringe populations, including Wales. Finding U5b in a modern Welsh person is finding something that has been in Western Britain for at least 10,000 years, possibly longer. It is finding a direct female line connection to the post-glacial migrants who first entered the Welsh mountains when the ice was still retreating. The persistence of these ancient lineages in the Welsh gene pool is not an accident. It is the consequence of thousands of years of geographic and demographic history that repeatedly preserved what was already there, while filtering out or limiting the admixture that would have diluted it. The haplogroup I1 and I2, which are associated with early European hunter-gatherers and which predate even the Western hunter-gatherers in some analyses, also show elevated frequencies in parts of the Atlantic fringe compared to most of England. These are very ancient European lineages, and their survival in the Atlantic populations at higher frequencies than elsewhere in Britain is further evidence of the same principle. The Atlantic fringe populations, including the Welsh, have preserved a higher proportion of the deep ancestral genetic heritage of Europe because their geography repeatedly shielded them from the demographic waves that diluted or replaced that heritage elsewhere. Understanding the physical differences between the Welsh and English populations means understanding all of this history, because the physical characteristics of a population are not random. They are the product of the genetic heritage that population carries, and that genetic heritage is the product of the demographic history we have been tracing. The elevated WHG ancestry in Welsh populations means that the pigmentation genetics associated with WHG populations, dark hair on pale skin with occasional red hair, are more prominently expressed in Wales than in areas with lower WHG ancestry. The lower relative steppe ancestry means that whatever pigmentation and morphological traits came with the Bell Beaker and Bronze Age steppe expansion are correspondingly less dominant in the Welsh genetic landscape. The absence of significant Anglo-Saxon genetic admixture means that the Germanic pigmentation patterns, slightly different from both WHG and steppe profiles, are not present in Welsh populations at the elevated frequencies found in eastern and central England. Each of these absences and presences contributes to the aggregate population-level physical profile that observers have noted for centuries without understanding the mechanism. The cranial morphology data, though less fashionable now in an era of genomic research, also tells a consistent story. Physical anthropologists working in the 19th and early 20th centuries documented regional variations in skull shape and facial structure across Britain that corresponded roughly to the genetic boundaries we now understand better. The Western British populations, including the Welsh, showed higher frequencies of certain morphological characteristics associated with older European populations. The dolichocephalic, or long-headed skull shape, that characterizes many WHG ancestry populations was documented at higher frequencies in Welsh archaeological samples from various periods than in comparable English samples. Some of these observations were wrapped in the pseudo-scientific racial frameworks of the Victorian and Edwardian period and need to be treated with appropriate caution. But the underlying observations were not entirely wrong, even if the interpretive frameworks applied to them were. There is genuine variation in cranial morphology across Britain that reflects genuine genetic variation, and that genetic variation reflects the demographic history we have now traced through ancient DNA. The skin tone variation across Britain follows a gradient that broadly matches the geographic pattern of ancient ancestry components. Moving from east to west across Britain, the average melanin content of skin tends to decrease and then increase again in a complex pattern that reflects not just UV exposure selection, but the underlying genetic heritage. The very pale, almost translucent skin quality associated with high WHG ancestry and with low eumelanin production shows up at higher frequency in Wales and Ireland and parts of Scotland than in England. This is not simply about latitude, because Wales and England are at similar latitudes. It reflects the different genetic ancestry profiles of the populations, which carry different frequencies of the variants that influence melanin production and distribution. The vascular quality of pale skin, the tendency to flush and redden under physical or emotional stress, is often more pronounced in high WHG ancestry populations and has been noted as a characteristic feature of Celtic populations by observers across historical periods. Whether this represents an actual physiological difference or simply the visibility of flushing in more deeply pale skin is debated, but the association is consistent enough to appear repeatedly in the literature. The eye color data for Wales is complicated by the fact that eye color is controlled by multiple genes and varies considerably within populations as well as between them. But the general pattern shows Wales having elevated frequencies of certain eye color variants associated with the WHG and older European population layers compared to the English average. Grey-green eyes, a phenotype associated with specific OCA2 region variant combinations that are common in WHG populations, seem to be somewhat more frequent in Welsh and Irish populations than in English ones. Blue eyes, associated with a different variant combination that also has high WHG frequency, but that became very common across Europe through multiple population layers, are common in both populations. The subtle differences in eye color distribution between Welsh and English populations are not the most dramatic expression of their genetic distinctiveness, but they are consistent with the deeper picture. The hair texture and growth pattern differences between Welsh and English populations have also been documented, though again these are population-level statistical differences rather than categorical distinctions. The finer, often darker hair texture associated with WHG ancestry populations shows up at higher frequencies in Wales, compared to the coarser or more varied hair texture distributions in English populations that reflect the greater contribution of multiple later migration layers. The tendency toward naturally wavy or curly hair that Tacitus noted in his description of the cilias and which he compared to Iberian populations is not imaginary. It reflects the same WHG ancestry connection that links the Atlantic populations of Britain to the Iberian refugia populations and ultimately to the deep ancestral heritage of these communities. The health implications of the different genetic profiles deserve mention because they are directly relevant to the lived experience of Welsh people in ways that go beyond the academic. The higher WHG ancestry in Welsh populations, combined with the specific patterns of selection that operated on those populations, produces population-level differences in disease susceptibility and resistance that have practical medical consequences. The hemochromatosis variant, which causes hereditary iron overload, is found at higher frequencies in populations with high Western hunter-gatherer ancestry, including the Welsh and Irish. The variant appears to have been selected for in Atlantic populations, possibly because it provided some protection against iron deficiency in populations that consumed less red meat than the steppe pastoralists who spread across much of Europe. In modern populations with access to iron-rich diets, the variant causes hemochromatosis, a condition that can damage the liver and other organs if not detected and treated. The elevated frequency of this variant in Wales compared to England has public health implications, and Welsh health authorities have been among the more active in addressing the condition. The elevated Rh-negative blood frequency in Wales has obstetric implications that require specific management in pregnancies with Rh-positive fathers. These are not negative characteristics of the Welsh population. They are the medical consequences of carrying a specific and ancient genetic heritage, and managing them effectively requires understanding that heritage. The skin cancer susceptibility associated with very pale skin and reduced melanin production is another area where the Welsh genetic profile has public health implications. The WHO data on skin cancer incidence in Wales reflects the elevated frequency of the pale skin and MC1R variants associated with high WHG ancestry. The psychological and cultural dimensions of Welsh distinctiveness are the hardest to disentangle from the genetic and physical ones, but they cannot be ignored in a complete account. Language is the most obvious cultural marker, and the Welsh language is genuinely in a category by itself among the languages of Britain. Its survival against enormous historical pressure, from the Romanization of the lowlands through the Anglo-Saxon period, through the Acts of Union, through the Industrial Revolution, through the 20th century school suppression, is a function of the same resilience that the genetics show. The communities that maintained Welsh were the same communities whose genetic profiles show the most continuity with the pre-Roman population. The landscape that preserved the language is the same landscape that preserved the ancient genetic layers. The language and the genetics are both expressions of the same underlying phenomenon, which is the ability of a specific mountainous Atlantic environment to protect its inhabitants from complete assimilation into successive waves of demographic and cultural change. The Welsh language today has around 600,000 speakers, which represents a recovery from the crisis point of the mid-20th century, when it seemed to some observers that the language might not survive another generation. The recovery reflects a combination of official support through Welsh language legislation, through Welsh medium education, through the Welsh language television channel S4C, and the organic vitality of communities where Welsh is still the natural medium of daily life. Those communities, the Welsh-speaking heartland of Gwynedd and Ceredigion and parts of Powys and Carmarthenshire, are also the communities where the most ancient genetic layers are most prominently preserved. The language and the genetics are not in a causal relationship in any simple sense, but they are both rooted in the same communities that have been in their places, in these mountains and valleys, for longer than most people appreciate. The Mabinogion, the collection of Welsh myths and stories, preserved in manuscripts from the 14th century, but reflecting oral traditions of much greater antiquity, describes a landscape that is recognizably the Welsh landscape, but inhabited by supernatural beings and governed by cosmological principles that reflect a very ancient way of understanding the world. The other world of Welsh mythology, Annon, is not a distant heaven or a separated realm. It is embedded in the landscape itself, accessible through specific geographical features, through lakes and mounds and liminal spaces where the ordinary world and the deeper world overlap. This cosmological geography is shared with Irish mythology and with elements of Scottish Gaelic tradition, suggesting a common Atlantic-Celtic inheritance that predates the historical period and traces back to the Iron Age and possibly earlier. It is the cosmological expression of the same deep landscape knowledge that the genetics reflect. Communities that have been in the same landscape for thousands of years develop a relationship with that landscape that cannot be adequately described in purely practical terms. The landscape becomes mythologized. It becomes the setting for stories that encode knowledge about how the world works and how to live in it well. The supernatural inhabitants of the Welsh landscape, the Tylwyth Teg or fair folk, the lake maidens, the figures of the Arthurian tradition, are cultural expressions of a relationship between people and place that has been accumulating for longer than anyone has been writing it down. The cultural distinctiveness of the Welsh people is inseparable from the genetic distinctiveness, because both are products of the same history. Arthur deserves a moment here, because the Arthurian tradition is one of the most debated and most discussed elements of Welsh cultural heritage, and because its historical roots illuminate the depth of Welsh cultural continuity. The historical Arthur, whatever figure or composite of figures lies behind the legend, was a late Roman or sub-Roman British warlord who operated in the period between the Roman withdrawal and the consolidation of Anglo-Saxon power across Britain. The earliest references to Arthur appear in Welsh sources, in the Y Gododin, and in the Historia Brittonum, attributed to the Welsh writer Nennius. The tradition was Welsh before it was anything else. It was the cultural property of the Brittonic-speaking peoples of Britain, the people who would become the Welsh and the Cornish and the Cumbrians and the Bretons, before it was appropriated by Norman French writers and transformed into the elaborate medieval romance cycle that most people know today. The Arthur stories preserve, in mythological form, the memory of the period when the Brittonic-speaking population of Britain was struggling to maintain itself against the Anglo-Saxon advance. Arthur is the hero of a people fighting to preserve what they are against a wave of replacement, and the fact that the Welsh have maintained the tradition so powerfully across so many centuries reflects a cultural memory of exactly the process that the genetics now allow us to trace in molecular detail. The Welsh preserved the Arthur tradition because Arthur, whatever his historical reality, was a symbol of their own persistence. He was the figure who fought against the historical process that separated the Welsh from the English, and who, in legend if not in history, almost reversed that process. The legend encodes the experience of a population that had survived displacement before and knew it could survive it again. The bardic tradition that preserved the Arthur stories and everything else of literary value in Welsh culture was itself a remarkable institution for the survival of cultural memory across time. The professional poets of medieval Wales, the poets of the princes and later of the gentry, composed within a strict technical tradition that required years of training and that maintained continuity of form and reference across centuries. A poem composed in the 14th century by Dafydd ap Gwilym, who is generally considered the greatest Welsh poet of the medieval period, maintains technical connections to poetic forms attested 1,000 years earlier. The continuity of the literary tradition mirrors the continuity of the genetic and cultural heritage, and it was maintained by the same communities in the same landscape. The Eisteddfod, the competitive festival of Welsh poetry and music and performance, has been held continuously in some form since at least the 12th century, and it continues today as one of the most distinctive cultural institutions in Europe. The National Eisteddfod, held annually in the first week of August, is conducted entirely in Welsh. It moves between North and South Wales in alternate years, and it draws tens of thousands of participants and visitors. It is an expression of Welsh cultural identity that is not primarily ethnic or exclusionary, but is rooted in the language and the tradition, and its continuity across more than 8 centuries is another expression of the same deep persistence that the genetics document. The connection to Brittany in northwestern France is another dimension of the Welsh story that is little known outside of specialist circles, but that adds an important element to the picture. Breton, the Celtic language spoken in Brittany, is a Brittonic language closely related to Welsh and Cornish. It was brought to Brittany by migrants from Britain during the 5th and 6th centuries, as the Anglo-Saxon advance pushed Brittonic-speaking populations both westward into Wales and Cornwall and southward across the Channel to the Armorican Peninsula of what is now northwestern France. The genetic connections between Brittany and Wales are measurable and reflect both the shared ancient ancestry and the historical migrations of the post-Roman period. Brittany shows elevated WHG ancestry relative to the rest of France, consistent with its Atlantic fringe position and with the demographic history of its Celtic-speaking population. The Breton language, like Welsh, survived against enormous pressure from the dominant state language, in this case French rather than English, and the mechanisms of its survival and the cultural institutions that maintained it show interesting parallels with the Welsh case. The Atlantic Celtic world, which includes Wales and Brittany and Ireland and Scotland, and the remnant Cornish community, represents the surviving fringe of a cultural and linguistic and genetic complex that once extended across much of Western Europe before the farming expansion and the steppe expansion and the Roman expansion and the Germanic migrations progressively dismantled it from the centre outward, leaving only the mountainous Atlantic edges still carrying the most ancient layers of the story. The sheep tell part of the story too, in a way that might seem unexpected but that reflects a genuine historical and genetic connection. The Welsh mountain sheep breeds, the Welsh mountain sheep and the Beulah speckled face, and the Llanwnog and the other breeds that have been developed for the specific conditions of the Welsh uplands, represent thousands of years of selective breeding by Welsh farmers who understood their landscape intimately enough to develop animal breeds perfectly adapted to its demands. The relationship between Welsh pastoral farming communities and their specific landscape is one of the deepest and most continuous in Europe. The system of transhumance, moving animals between valley lowland in winter and mountain upland in summer, known in Welsh as the Hafod and Hondra system, was practiced continuously in Wales for centuries before it was finally abandoned in the 20th century under the pressure of modern agricultural economics. The Hafodid, the summer farmsteads high on the mountain slopes where farmers and their families moved with the animals each summer, are now ruined stone buildings in the landscape, but they were active living places for many generations. The knowledge encoded in that transhumance system, the seasonal patterns of vegetation and weather and animal behavior in specific Welsh upland areas, is exactly the kind of deep landscape knowledge that the genetic evidence suggests has been accumulating in these communities since the post-glacial period. It is not the same knowledge in an unbroken line from the Mesolithic, of course, but it is knowledge built on the same foundation, by communities that have been in the same landscape, maintaining the same basic relationship with the same basic resource base, for far longer than the historical record can explicitly document. The question of what all of this means for understanding modern Welsh identity is one that requires care. The genetic distinctiveness of the Welsh population is real, but it does not define what it means to be Welsh in any simple or deterministic way. Welsh identity is also a matter of culture, language, community, and choice. There are Welsh people of diverse genetic backgrounds who are Welsh in every meaningful cultural sense, and there are people of Welsh genetic heritage living elsewhere who have no particular connection to Welsh culture or language. The genetic story is not a story about who counts as authentically Welsh. It is a story about how the population that has historically occupied Wales came to have the genetic profile it has, and about why that profile is different from the English one. The difference is real and substantial, and traceable through thousands of years of recorded and recoverable history. Understanding it enriches our understanding of how populations form and persist and change over time. It illuminates the mechanisms by which landscapes shape the peoples who inhabit them, and it provides a foundation for understanding the physical and cultural distinctiveness of the Welsh people that goes far deeper than the political history that most people know. The mountains made Wales what it is, genetically and culturally and linguistically. The mountains stood between the Welsh population and the demographic forces that repeatedly reshaped the genetics of the English lowlands. The mountains protected, and what they protected accumulated over thousands of years into something genuinely distinctive, a population that carries in its genome and its language and its culture the accumulated inheritance of 12,000 years of continuous presence in a specific and demanding landscape. The Norman castle builders understood this in a practical sense, even if they could not articulate the genetic dimension. The ring of Norman and later English castles around the Welsh Highlands, Caernarfon and Harlech and Beaumaris and Conwy, and the others that Edward I built after his conquest of Gwynedd in 1282, was intended to encircle and contain a population whose relationship with its own terrain was so thorough that controlling the terrain was the only viable strategy. Edward did not try to change the Welsh into Englishmen. He tried to surround them with English garrison towns and English administrative structures, and hoped that the Welsh would eventually be absorbed into the English cultural and political world through the slow pressure of proximity. It worked, eventually, in the areas closest to the English border and in the plantation towns that grew up around the Edwardian castles. It worked less thoroughly in the upland communities that the castles were designed to contain. The populations of those upland communities continued to be Welsh, continued to speak Welsh, continued to maintain the cultural and social structures that had been there before the Normans and before the Saxons and before the Romans. They are still there, and the genetics of their descendants still reflect, measurably and consistently, the deep history that produced them. The 21st century has brought new tools for understanding this history and new obligations to interpret it carefully. The ancient DNA revolution has transformed our ability to trace the movements of populations across time and space with a precision that would have seemed impossible a generation ago. The archaeogenomics research being conducted by teams across Britain and Europe is producing results that consistently reinforce and deepen the picture we have been developing here. Each new study of ancient genomes from Welsh sites or from comparable Atlantic fringe populations adds detail and resolution to the story. The genetic continuity between ancient and modern Welsh populations in the areas of Wales with the most stable residential histories is among the most remarkable findings in British archaeogenomics. In some rural Welsh communities, The genetic profile of the living population is more similar to Bronze Age and even Neolithic individuals from the same region than it is to any other modern British population. This is not evidence that nothing changed in Wales over 4,000 years. Of course things changed, but it is evidence that the changes that did occur were less disruptive and less genetically transformative than the changes that occurred in more accessible parts of Britain. The landscape did what it has always done. It preserved what was already there while allowing enough incoming influence to maintain the adaptability and genetic health of the population without overwhelming the ancient inheritance that makes the Welsh distinctive. The obligation that comes with understanding this history is to treat it with honesty and care. It is easy to misuse the kind of genetic evidence we have been discussing, to turn it into an argument for ethnic purity or national superiority or some other political agenda that the evidence itself does not support and that the researchers who produced it would reject. The Welsh population is distinctive, but it is not pure, in the sense that it has been shaped by admixture and migration throughout its history, including significant admixture during the industrial period and continuing admixture in the modern era. What is distinctive is not the absence of mixing, but the particular proportions of ancient ancestry layers that have been preserved more thoroughly in Wales than in England due to the specific history of migration and terrain-mediated demographic preservation we have traced. That preservation is a historical fact with cultural and physical consequences that deserve to be understood. It does not make Welsh people better or worse than anyone else. It makes them the inheritors of a specific and ancient slice of European genetic heritage that is genuinely valuable as a window onto the deep past of the continent. Understanding it properly requires humility about what genetics can and cannot tell us, honesty about the limits of the evidence, and care not to conflate statistical population-level patterns with individual identity or worth. The story we have been telling is ultimately a story about the relationship between people and place played out over 12,000 years. It begins with the retreating ice and the northward migration of post-glacial hunter-gatherers along the Atlantic coast. It continues through the Neolithic farming expansion and the Bronze Age steppe migration and the Iron Age cultural developments and the Roman interlude and the Anglo-Saxon transformation and the Norman reshaping and the long, post-medieval period of political absorption without demographic replacement. At each stage, the Welsh landscape did what landscapes do. It shaped the people who lived in it, and it preserved, imperfectly but consistently, more of what was already there than the more accessible lowland terrain to the east could manage. The result, accumulated across all those layers and all those centuries, is a population that is genuinely and measurably distinct from its nearest neighbours, in ways that go far deeper than language or flag or rugby allegiance or political aspiration. The distinction is written in the genome. It is expressed in the physical characteristics that observers from Tacitus to modern geneticists have noted and measured. And it is rooted in the mountains that have always been there, older than any of the people who ever lived among them, indifferent to the particular human drama playing out across their slopes, but shaping that drama profoundly nonetheless. The mountains were there before the Welsh arrived. They will be there long after any of us who are alive today have gone. And in the meantime, they continue to do what they have always done, to make the people of Wales into something recognisably, measurably, and magnificently their own. The Severn Estuary itself is worth pausing on because it is one of those geographical features that has functioned as a boundary across so many different periods of history that it has become almost invisible in its importance. The Severn is the longest river in Britain. It rises in central Wales, in the uplands of Powys, and flows southward and then eastward in a great arc before opening into the Bristol Channel and ultimately the Atlantic. For most of its length, it has served as a permeable but real boundary between Wales and England, a line that people and goods and ideas have crossed continuously, but that has also consistently marked the eastern edge of the Welsh world. The estuary in particular, with its exceptional tidal range and its shifting mudflats and its complex current patterns, created a formidable barrier against movement in the pre-bridge period. The Severn Road Bridge was not opened until 1966, and before that, the river could only be crossed by ferry at a small number of points or by road bridges much further upriver. This meant that the communities of South Wales were more isolated from the English Midlands and South West than their geographic proximity might suggest. The people of Monmouthshire and Glamorgan, looking across the estuary to Somerset and Gloucestershire, were separated from those counties by a water crossing that was genuinely difficult and dangerous for most of history. That separation reinforced the demographic distinctiveness that the terrain of the uplands maintained in a different way. West of the Severn, the Welsh world. East of it, an increasingly English one, even in the border counties that had always been contested and mixed. The tidal bore of the Severn, one of the largest in the world, is itself a feature that the Welsh would have known intimately and that English visitors often encountered with surprise and alarm. The bore is a wave produced by the funnel shape of the estuary, concentrating the incoming tide into a surge that travels upstream at speed, sometimes reaching 3 or 4 meters in height and covering several miles of river. It is a spectacular and potentially deadly natural phenomenon, and communities living along the estuary banks would have needed to understand its timing and patterns as a basic matter of survival. The bore is predictable if you know the tidal and lunar cycles that govern it, and the communities that fished and farmed and travelled along the Severn would have accumulated that predictive knowledge across generations. This is the same kind of deep landscape knowledge that the genetic evidence points toward, a knowledge built up across generations of people living in intimate relationship with a specific and demanding natural system. The Roman road network in Wales tells an interesting story about the relationship between the occupying power and the indigenous population. The roads the Romans built were primarily military roads, designed to move troops and supplies and to connect the legionary fortresses and auxiliary forts that held the population of Cambria under surveillance. They were not designed to integrate Wales into the Roman economic system in the way that the road networks of lowland Britain were designed. The Welsh road network reflected the military function of Wales in the Roman strategic framework. It was a territory to be policed, not fully absorbed. The difference between the Roman approach to lowland Britain and to the Welsh Highlands is visible in the degree of urban development. Lowland Roman Britain was dotted with towns, civitas capitals, and market towns and posting stations, linked by an efficient road network and connected to the wider Roman economy through trade in both directions. Roman Wales had military forts, some larger supply bases, and the one major legionary fortress at Caerleon, but nothing comparable to the urban network of the lowlands. The Roman occupation of Wales was an occupation, not a colonization. That distinction has genetic consequences. Colonial settlement would have introduced a significant Roman-era genetic admixture. Military occupation with a relatively small and rotating garrison did not. The Welsh gene pool, at the end of the Roman period, was not meaningfully different from what it had been at the beginning, a pattern of minimal admixture from the occupying power that contrasts sharply with what happened in some parts of lowland Britain, where Roman soldiers from across the empire settled and contributed to the local gene pool. The Celtic saints of the 5th and 6th centuries, the figures like Dewi Sant, the patron saint of Wales, and Iltyd and Cadoc and Dyfrig and Padarn and many others, established the ecclesiastical framework that would shape Welsh culture through the medieval period, and that preserved elements of the older culture within a new religious form. The Celtic Church of the post-Roman period was organized around monasteries rather than dioceses and bishops, and those monasteries became centers of learning and manuscript production that preserved Latin classical learning alongside Welsh vernacular tradition in a distinctive synthesis that set the Welsh ecclesiastical world apart from the Roman ecclesiastical structure that eventually absorbed it. The school, established by Iltyd at Llaniltyd Fawr in Glamorgan in the late 5th century, was one of the most significant centers of learning in the early medieval British Isles, producing scholars and missionaries who spread across the Atlantic world, to Ireland and to Brittany and to Rome itself. The continuity between the pre-Roman Iron Age religious landscape and the Celtic Christian landscape that succeeded it in Wales is a matter of ongoing scholarly debate, but the evidence for continuity in specific sacred sites is substantial. Many of the early Welsh Christian foundations were built on sites that had been sacred before Christianity, at springs and groves and hills that carried religious significance in the pre-Christian Celtic framework. The spring, associated with Dewi Sant at St. David's, the site of the early Welsh monastic foundation that became one of the most important pilgrimage centres in medieval Britain, is a physical feature of the landscape that was sacred before any Christian association was attached to it. The act of Christianizing an existing sacred site, rather than abandoning it, preserved the cultural memory encoded in the landscape, even as the religious framework was transformed. These are not the practices of a conquered and replaced population. They are the practices of a population that maintained enough cultural continuity and enough density in its own landscape to absorb a new religious form without being entirely reshaped by it. The medieval Welsh law codes, associated in tradition with Hywel Dda, the 10th century king who unified much of Wales under a single legal framework, are one of the most remarkable documents of early medieval European legal culture. The law of Hywel, Cyfraith Hywel, was not a creation from nothing. It was a codification and systematization of existing legal custom that had been developing in Wales for centuries before Hywel brought it into a coherent, written form. Its content reflects the specific social and economic conditions of Welsh pastoral society. The laws about cattle, which were the primary unit of wealth in the Welsh economy, are detailed and sophisticated in ways that reflect generations of accumulated legal thinking about the specific problems of a pastoral community in an upland landscape. The laws about kinship and inheritance reflect a social structure organized around extended family groups with shared responsibility and shared rights over land and livestock. The laws about boundaries and territories encode the kind of dense geographical knowledge that comes from communities living in intimate relationship with a specific landscape over many generations. The survival of Cyfraith Hywel as a distinct legal system, operating in Wales alongside but separate from English common law until the Acts of Union imposed English law, is another expression of the same cultural continuity that the genetics document. Welsh society maintained its own internal logic, its own way of organizing the relationships between people and land and animals, for far longer than most comparable European societies managed to maintain their pre-feudal legal traditions. The mining and metallurgical history of Wales adds an economic dimension to the story that is worth tracing because it connects the ancient and modern dimensions of Welsh distinctiveness. Wales has been mined for metal since the Bronze Age. The copper mines of the Great Orme in North Wales, which were worked extensively from around 1800 to 1400 BCE, are among the most important Bronze Age mining sites in Europe. The scale of the Great Orme operation was remarkable. Thousands of tons of rock were removed and processed to extract copper that was traded across Britain and into continental Europe. The people doing this work were the same people whose descendants would eventually become the Welsh, and the knowledge they developed about the metalliferous geology of northwest Wales was the beginning of a tradition of mining expertise that would continue, in different forms, for 4,000 years. The copper mines of the Romans in the same area, the medieval lead and silver mines of mid-Wales, the slate quarries of Snowdonia that supplied roofing material across the Victorian world, and finally the coal mines of South Wales that powered the Industrial Revolution. Each of these extractive industries drew on landscape knowledge accumulated across previous generations, and each of them reinforced the relationship between Welsh communities and their specific terrain in ways that further deepened the cultural distinctiveness that the genetics reflect. The slate quarrying communities of North Wales, particularly around Bethesda and Blaenau, Festiniog and Llanberis, developed a culture that was in some ways the most purely Welsh in modern history. Welsh was not just spoken in these communities. It was the language of work, of union organisation, of chapels and Eisteddfod Fodau, and libraries and debating societies. The quarrymen created a distinctive culture that combined the ancient pastoral Welsh world with the demands of industrial labour in a way that preserved the essential Welsh cultural framework, even as the economic basis shifted from farming to quarrying. The Great Strike of Penrhyn, lasting 3 years from 1900 to 1903, was one of the longest and most bitter industrial disputes in British history, and it was conducted in Welsh, organised by Welsh-speaking workers against an English-speaking aristocratic employer, and it produced a solidarity and a collective identity that was deeply rooted in the same cultural continuity we have been tracing through the genetics and the language and the landscape. The communities of the slate quarrying districts are among the most thoroughly Welsh-speaking in the country today, and their genetic profiles reflect the same pattern of ancient ancestry preservation that characterises the most stable Welsh communities elsewhere. The tradition of choral singing in Wales is another expression of cultural distinctiveness that has its roots in the specific social conditions of Welsh life, and that has been maintained with remarkable continuity through historical periods that disrupted or ended comparable traditions elsewhere. The Welsh choral tradition developed particularly strongly in the industrial valleys of South Wales during the 19th century, where it provided a form of cultural expression and community solidarity that was accessible to working men with limited leisure time and no expensive instruments. But the tradition is older than the industrial period. The Welsh bardic tradition included musical performance as well as poetry, and the integration of music into community, religious, and cultural life was a feature of Welsh society long before the industrial transformation. The nonconformist chapel culture that dominated South Wales from the 18th century onward intensified the musical tradition by making communal singing a central element of religious practice. The Sunday morning and evening services of the Methodist and Baptist and Congregationalist chapels were occasions for singing of genuine artistic quality, and the competitive tradition of the Eisteddfod provided a framework for developing and displaying that quality. The result was a culture in which musical ability was widely distributed across the population, not the preserve of professionals or aristocratic patrons, but a common inheritance that the community maintained collectively. The great Welsh choral tradition, from the 19th century male voice choirs to the contemporary performing arts culture of the country, is continuous with the bardic tradition of the medieval period and with the musical dimensions of Celtic culture that are attested in the earliest historical sources. It is another thread in the pattern of cultural continuity that runs through the Welsh story. The relationship between the Welsh language and the Welsh landscape is encoded in the place names in a way that makes the landscape itself a kind of archive. Welsh place names are predominantly descriptive in the most direct sense. They describe the geographical feature that the place is located at or named for. The Welsh language contains an exceptionally rich vocabulary for landscape features, distinguishing between types of valley, types of slope, types of water body, types of soil, types of vegetation, in ways that reflect thousands of years of farmers and herders and hunters paying close attention to the specific qualities of specific pieces of land. The word nant means stream, but implies a stream in a steep valley. The word afon means river in a more general sense. Tweliem is a bowl-shaped valley, typically glacially carved. Glyn is a valley more generally. Blelch is a mountain pass. Blaen is a valley head. Reed is a ford. Pont is a bridge. These are not merely different words for the same thing. They are precise terms for different physical realities, developed by communities who needed to navigate and describe a complex mountain landscape with accuracy. The density of this topographic vocabulary in Welsh place names means that every village name and every farmstead name and every field name is a compressed piece of information about the physical geography of the location, readable by anyone who knows the language. The place name tradition is a geography lesson encoded in language, and it represents the accumulated perceptual knowledge of many generations of people living in intimate relationship with a demanding landscape. The same tradition exists in Gaelic and in Breton, reflecting the common Atlantic Celtic heritage of these communities. But it is particularly rich and particularly continuous in Wales, where the language has survived in its homeland rather than being transplanted to a diaspora context. The literature of the land, the Dinllensias tradition, as it is called in Irish and cognate to traditions in Welsh, is a body of knowledge that encodes information about the landscape in narrative form. Stories attached to specific places that explain the names and the features and the events associated with them. The Welsh equivalents, the trioed Wynys Prydain or triads of the island of Britain, the local legends and hagiographic traditions attached to specific sites, the mythological geography of the Arthurian tradition, all of these are forms of knowledge organization that encode geographical and historical information in ways that are accessible to an oral or semi-literate community. The landscape of Wales is mapped, not just in the Ordnance Survey sense, but in a deeper mythological sense, with every significant feature carrying a story and every story encoding information about the place and its history. This kind of mythological geography does not develop overnight. It accumulates across generations of people paying attention to the same landscape and building up a narrative web that makes the landscape comprehensible and meaningful and manageable. Its presence in Wales, still accessible through the language and the tradition, is evidence of the same long-term continuity that the genetics document. You cannot build this kind of cultural landscape map in a few centuries. It requires the unbroken presence of a community in a place across the kind of timescale that the genetic evidence confirms. The annual cycle of Welsh rural life, the pattern of seasonal activities that structured the year for farming and pastoral communities before the industrial transformation, reflects the deep adaptation of the Welsh population to its specific landscape and climate. The spring lambing season in the uplands, the hay harvest in the valley meadows, the autumn movement of animals back down from the high summer pastures, the winter maintenance of stock in byres and farmsteads close to the valley floor. These seasonal rhythms, maintained continuously in Welsh rural communities for thousands of years before industrial agriculture disrupted them, are not just economic activities, they are cultural activities that define the relationship between the community and its landscape. The annual fairs and markets that accompanied the seasonal movements of animals were occasions for social exchange, for the movement of information and goods and marriage partners between communities. They were the connective tissue of Welsh rural society, binding together communities that were otherwise separated by the difficult terrain. And they maintained patterns of social interaction that reinforced the demographic coherence of the Welsh upland communities, ensuring that people continued to marry within their own regional networks rather than being drawn into the wider English marriage market that would have diluted the genetic distinctiveness over time. The persistence of these cultural patterns into the modern period, even in attenuated form, is part of the reason that the genetic distinctiveness of Welsh rural communities is still measurable today. The weather of Wales is itself a factor in the story. Wales is one of the wettest parts of Britain, receiving more annual rainfall than almost any other part of the island. The westerly winds that come off the Atlantic carry moisture that the Welsh mountains force upward, cooling and condensing it into rain that falls on the Welsh side of the mountains, while the eastern side, in the rain shadow, is drier. The exceptional wetness of Welsh upland areas is not a comfortable characteristic in human terms. It makes the landscape cold and often miserable in the modern sedentary sense. But for the communities that had adapted to it over generations, it was a resource. The high rainfall fed the rivers that provided water, power, and fish. It maintained the pastures that supported the sheep and cattle economy. It created the boglands that preserved organic materials, including, as it turns out, human remains. The Welsh bog bodies, found at various locations across the country, are evidence of the same Iron Age cultural practices documented by the better-known Danish and Irish bog bodies. The community of practice that deposited votive offerings and, in some cases, human sacrificial or judicial victims in the bogs of Wales was the same Iron Age Celtic community whose language and whose genetic inheritance survived into the Welsh population of the historic period. The bogs preserved those bodies in the same way that the landscape preserved the population, not perfectly but substantially, maintaining enough of what was there to tell the story to those who came later with the tools to read it. The concept of hiraeth in Welsh is often cited as an untranslatable Welsh emotion, a longing for something lost or unattainable that is particularly associated with the Welsh relationship to landscape and heritage. It is a word that defies simple translation into English, though longing and yearning and homesickness all gesture toward parts of its meaning. What hiraeth captures, in the Welsh cultural context, is the particular quality of attachment to a specific place that comes from deep roots in that place, combined with the awareness of loss and change and distance. It is the emotion of a diaspora community remembering the homeland. It is the emotion of a community that has seen its landscape and its language and its culture threatened and in some cases significantly damaged. It is the emotional expression of the same cultural continuity we have been tracing through the genetics and the history. You cannot have hiraeth without the deep roots that make the loss meaningful, and the Welsh people have those roots going down through thousands of years of continuous presence in a specific landscape. The untranslatability of hiraeth into English is itself a data point. English, the language of a population that has been assembled from more diverse sources over a shorter continuous period in a more accessible terrain, does not have a word for the precise quality of longing that comes from that depth of rootedness. Welsh does, because the Welsh experience that depth of rootedness in a way that the English experience does not, and the genetic evidence explains why. The relationship between the Welsh and the sea is another dimension of their distinctiveness that connects them to the wider Atlantic world. Wales has a coastline of more than 1,000 miles when you count the inlets and peninsulas and islands, and that coastline has always been a connection to the Atlantic world rather than a barrier to it. The maritime tradition of Welsh communities, particularly in the south and west, connects Wales to the wider Atlantic Celtic world of Ireland and Brittany and Cornwall and beyond. The curragh, the traditional skin boat of the Irish Atlantic tradition, had cognates in Welsh maritime culture. Welsh fishermen worked the same Atlantic waters as their Irish and Breton counterparts, and the maritime trade networks of the pre-modern Atlantic connected Welsh ports to the wider world in ways that are not always visible in the conventional historical narrative, which tends to focus on the land-based connections between Wales and England. The Atlantic trade was more important to Wales in some periods than the land trade with England, and it maintained connections to other Atlantic Celtic communities that reinforced the cultural and possibly the genetic distinctiveness of the Welsh Atlantic-facing communities. The influence of Welsh missionaries on Irish and Breton Christianity in the early medieval period reflects the maritime connections between these communities. The trading relationships between Welsh wool merchants and their Breton and Iberian counterparts in the medieval and early modern periods maintained the economic Atlantic dimension. And the genetic connections between these Atlantic communities, all showing elevated WHG ancestry and all maintaining elements of Celtic linguistic and cultural tradition, reflect the deeper shared history that the maritime trade routes reinforced across historical time. The question of what makes Wales and its people distinct from England and the English is ultimately a question about the relationship between environment and biology, and culture played out over the longest timescale that any of those dimensions can be traced. The genetic distinctiveness is real and measurable, and rooted in differential migration histories that go back to the post-glacial period. The physical distinctiveness is real and consistent, and reflects the different ancestry proportions that produce different statistical distributions of pigmentation and morphological characteristics. The cultural and linguistic distinctiveness is real and profound and maintained across centuries of political pressure, because it was rooted in the same communities and the same landscape that produced and preserved the genetic distinctiveness. These are not three separate stories. They are one story told in three different registers: genetic, physical, and cultural, all pointing to the same underlying reality. Wales is a place that has been inhabited by a population with extraordinary continuity for an extraordinary length of time, and that continuity has produced a population that is genuinely, measurably, and fascinatingly distinct from its nearest neighbours. The mountains made it possible, the people made it real, and the language gave it a voice that has been speaking continuously in recognisable form for longer than almost any other language on earth. That is the real reason the Welsh look nothing like the English. That is the real reason the difference is written in blood and bone as well as in language and culture. That is the story that begins 12,000 years ago, when the ice retreated and the first post-glacial migrants followed the Atlantic coast northward into an empty and waiting land, carrying in their cells the genetic inheritance that would eventually, after 12,000 years of accumulation and preservation and differential mixing, produce the people who call themselves Cymry and their land Cymry, and their language Cymraeg, and who carry in their genomes a message from the deep past of Europe that no subsequent wave of migration has been able to fully overwrite. The Iron Age hill forts of Wales are among the most impressive and most poorly understood monuments in the prehistoric British Isles. There are more than 600 of them, distributed across the country from the borders with England to the furthest headlands of Pembrokeshire and the heights of Snowdonia. They range in size from small defended enclosures that might have housed a single extended family group to enormous multi-vallate fortifications like Tre Seri on the Lane Peninsula, which enclosed an area of nearly 7 acres and whose stone ramparts still stand to considerable height after 2,500 years. The sheer number and distribution of these hill forts tells you something important about the Iron Age population of Wales. These were not the defences of a sparse and scattered people. These were the infrastructure of a society with considerable population density, sophisticated engineering capability, and the social organization to mobilize large numbers of people for collective construction projects. The labour required to build a major hill fort, to quarry and carry and position the thousands of tons of stone that make up the walls of a site like Pendennis near Aberystwyth, is not achievable by a small or poorly organised community. The Iron Age Welsh were a competent and populous people, and their hill forts are evidence of that competence and that population. The distribution of hill forts also tells you something about the social structure of Iron Age Wales. They were not evenly distributed, which would suggest a single unified political authority placing them according to a strategic plan. They were distributed in patterns that suggest multiple local tribal territories, each with its own central place and its own network of subsidiary defended sites. This is consistent with the tribal complexity that the Roman sources describe, a mosaic of distinct groups with distinct territories and distinct social hierarchies, sharing broadly similar cultural and linguistic frameworks, but not unified under a single political structure. The complexity and sophistication of that social landscape is itself evidence of the deep time depth of human presence in Wales. Communities do not develop that kind of intricate territorial and social organisation quickly. It requires generations of people in the same landscape, developing the relationships and the institutions and the symbolic frameworks that allow for stable territorial division and dispute resolution and collective action. The Iron Age hill forts are the physical expression of a social landscape that had been centuries in the building by the time the Romans arrived to disrupt it. The metallurgical knowledge of the Iron Age Welsh communities extended beyond the copper they had worked since the Bronze Age, to include iron smelting, which requires different ore sources and different technical procedures. The iron ore deposits of Wales, particularly in the south, were exploited from the early Iron Age period onward, and the iron-working communities of the valleys developed a technological tradition that would eventually contribute to the industrial transformation of the 19th century. The continuity between the ancient metalworking tradition and the modern one is not a direct line of technical transmission. The specific techniques changed enormously between the hand-worked iron of the Iron Age and the industrial blast furnace iron of the 18th and 19th centuries. But the knowledge that Wales contained workable metal deposits, encoded in place names and in the accumulated geological knowledge of communities that had been mining and smelting for millennia, was part of the intellectual inheritance that guided the industrial pioneers who transformed South Wales into one of the great metalworking centres of the world. The communities that worked iron in the 18th century, Merthyr Tydfil, were in a direct line of cultural and in many cases genetic descent from the communities that worked copper on the Great Orme 3,000 years earlier. The Industrial Revolution did not create the Welsh metalworking tradition from nothing. It industrialised a tradition that was already ancient. The history of the Welsh nonconformist chapels is inseparable from the history of Welsh cultural survival in the modern period, and it deserves more attention than it typically receives in conventional accounts of British religious history. The Methodist revival that transformed Wales in the 18th century, associated particularly with the names of Howell Harris and Daniel Rowland and William Williams Pantycelyn, was not simply a religious phenomenon, it was a cultural phenomenon of the first importance. The revival created institutions, chapels and Sunday schools and prayer meetings and singing festivals that operated entirely in Welsh and that provided the organisational framework for Welsh community life in an era when the official institutions of church and state were operating in English. The Sunday school movement in Wales, developed by Thomas Charles of Bala from the 1780s onward, created a mass literacy in Welsh that gave the language a new generation of readers and writers at precisely the moment when industrialisation and English medium education might otherwise have undermined it. The chapels were places where Welsh was the only language of religious life, where the sermons and the prayers and the hymns and the communal discussion were all in Welsh, and where the Welsh community could encounter its own cultural heritage in an institutional setting that carried authority and prestige. The great Welsh preachers of the 18th and 19th centuries, preaching to congregations of hundreds and sometimes thousands in the open air, were maintaining the bardic tradition of public oral performance in a new religious context. They were using the Welsh language with the same sophistication and the same attention to the aesthetic possibilities of the language that the medieval poets had used, and they were reaching audiences across the whole of Welsh society in a way that the aristocratic patronage system of the medieval bardic tradition never could. The chapel culture was the democratization of Welsh cultural tradition, and it sustained the language through the period of greatest danger. The Welsh education system underwent a transformation in the 20th century that has no parallel in English educational history, the development of a fully funded Welsh medium school sector from primary through secondary level. The Welsh medium schools, Ysgolion Cymreg, now educate a significant proportion of Welsh children, and crucially, they educate children from non-Welsh-speaking homes as well as from Welsh-speaking ones. This means that Welsh is not merely being maintained in communities where it was always spoken. It is being transmitted to new communities, creating Welsh speakers from families that had not spoken the language for generations, or in some cases had never spoken it. The growth of the Welsh medium education sector in recent decades is one of the more remarkable language revitalization stories in Europe, achieved without the kind of radical nationalist politics that characterized some comparable language recovery movements elsewhere. It was achieved through institutional persistence, through the advocacy of parents who wanted their children to be educated in Welsh, through the political will to fund a dual-language education system in a relatively small country, and through the organic vitality of communities where Welsh remained a living language capable of transmitting itself naturally to the next generation. The success of Welsh language revitalization stands in stark contrast to the fate of Cornish, the closely related Brittonic language spoken in Cornwall, which became extinct as a community language in the 18th century, and has been subject to revival efforts ever since, without achieving the kind of natural intergenerational transmission that Welsh maintains. The difference between Welsh survival and Cornish extinction reflects, among other things, the difference in terrain and demographic history between the two areas. Cornwall is smaller and more accessible and was more thoroughly incorporated into the English economic and cultural sphere at an earlier period. Wales is larger and more defensible and maintained its population in a more continuous relationship with the land for longer. The same factors that preserved the WHG ancestry in the Welsh gene pool also preserved the language in the Welsh communities. The genetic data on Welsh diaspora communities adds an interesting dimension to the story that allows us to test some of the claims we have been making about the relationship between Welsh genetic heritage and the specific Welsh landscape. Large Welsh communities established themselves in Patagonia, in Argentina, in the late 19th century, when the Welsh settlement, Wladfa, was founded in 1865 as a deliberate attempt to create a Welsh-speaking colony in a part of the world where the settlers hoped to be free from English cultural pressure. The Patagonian Welsh community maintained the Welsh language with remarkable fidelity across more than a century and a half, and the community still exists today with a living Welsh-speaking tradition and institutions that maintain cultural connections with Wales. The genetic profile of the Patagonian Welsh community reflects the founder population that established the settlement in 1865, with subsequent local admixture from the surrounding Argentinian and indigenous Tehuelche population. The founder population itself reflected the genetic profile of the Welsh communities from which the settlers were drawn, predominantly rural Welsh-speaking communities from Ceredigion and other parts of West Wales. The Patagonian Welsh community is in effect a frozen snapshot of a 19th century Welsh gene pool preserved in a different hemisphere, while the Welsh homeland continued its own demographic evolution. Studies comparing the Patagonian Welsh genetic profile with that of modern Welsh communities and with ancient DNA from Welsh archaeological sites allow researchers to trace which components of the Welsh genetic heritage have been most stable across time and geography. The results are consistent with what we would predict from the historical analysis. The ancient ancestry components, the WHG signal and the early Neolithic signal, and the Bronze Age signal, are present in the Patagonian Welsh community at frequencies consistent with their presence in the 19th century Welsh rural population from which the founders were drawn, and that population itself showed genetic continuity with much older Welsh populations. The connections between Wales and the wider Celtic world were maintained in the modern period through cultural rather than genetic channels, since the mass migrations that had connected these communities in the Iron Age and early medieval period were no longer occurring. But cultural connections can reinforce genetic distinctiveness in indirect ways by reinforcing the cultural identity of Atlantic Celtic communities in ways that reduce outmarriage and maintain the demographic coherence of the genetic community. The Pan-Celtic movement, which emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as an expression of solidarity between the Celtic-speaking peoples of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Brittany, Cornish revivalist Cornwall, and the Isle of Man, created a framework for cultural exchange and mutual recognition that helped each of these communities understand their distinctiveness in a wider context. The Inter-Celtic Festival, held annually in Lorient in Brittany, is the most prominent expression of this pan-Celtic cultural solidarity, drawing participants from all 6 Celtic nations and maintaining cultural connections that are ultimately rooted in the shared ancient genetic heritage of Atlantic fringe populations. When Welsh musicians perform alongside Irish and Breton musicians at a pan-Celtic festival, they are not simply sharing a contemporary cultural enthusiasm. They are expressing a real underlying connection that can now be traced in molecular detail through the ancient DNA evidence of their shared Western hunter-gatherer ancestry and their shared Atlantic Celtic cultural heritage. The cultural solidarity and the genetic relatedness are both real and both rooted in the same ancient history. The sheep and the poetry and the mountains and the language and the rain. These are the things that most people associate with Wales if they are being honest, and they are not wrong to associate them because all of these things are real, and all of them are connected to the deeper story we have been telling. The sheep are there because the landscape is better suited to pastoralism than arable farming, and the landscape is better suited to pastoralism because it is mountainous and wet, and the mountainous and wet landscape is the reason the population of Wales has the genetic profile it has. The poetry is there because the language survived, and the language survived because the communities that spoke it were rooted deeply enough in their landscape to resist displacement, and that deep-rootedness is itself a consequence of the same terrain that favoured pastoralism over arable farming and preserved ancient genetic layers against the demographic waves that diluted them elsewhere. The mountains are the foundation of everything. The rain that falls on them feeds the rivers and the pastures and the peat bogs that have preserved the evidence of the long human presence. The language that describes them carries vocabulary developed across thousands of years of people paying close attention to their specific qualities. And the people who live among them carry in their genes a message from the deep past of Europe, a message that genomic science is now beginning to read with the kind of precision that allows us to say, with genuine confidence and genuine wonder, that the real reason the Welsh look nothing like the English is that they are, in the most profound and measurable biological sense, not the same people. They are older. They are more continuous with the first inhabitants of the island. They are the inheritors of a genetic and cultural heritage that elsewhere in Britain was diluted and transformed and ultimately replaced by successive waves of migration, but that in Wales was preserved by the same mountains and the same rain and the same difficult terrain that made Wales what it is and that made the Welsh who they are. The academic discipline of archaeogenomics, the application of ancient DNA analysis to questions about population history, is still young enough that its practitioners are cautious about strong claims. The ancient DNA revolution is only about 15 years old in its mature form, and new data emerges every year that refines and sometimes revises earlier interpretations. But the broad outlines of the story we have been telling are now robust enough that they appear consistently across multiple independent studies using different methodologies and different sample sets. The higher Western hunter-gatherer ancestry in Welsh populations compared to English populations is not a finding from a single study that might prove to be an artifact of sampling or methodology. It is a finding that has been replicated across multiple studies by multiple research teams using genomes from multiple ancient and modern Welsh individuals and comparing them to comparable data from English populations. The lower relative steppe ancestry in Wales compared to England is similarly robust. The relative absence of significant Germanic ancestry corresponding to the Anglo-Saxon migration is confirmed by both the ancient DNA evidence and the fine-grained modern genome data. These are not contested findings in the technical literature. They are established results that form part of the accepted framework for understanding the population history of Britain. What remains more speculative is the precise mechanism by which each of these historical differences arose. The role of the terrain in limiting the spread of the Neolithic farming expansion is well supported, but difficult to quantify precisely. The relative importance of the terrain versus other factors, such as population density in the pre-existing Welsh communities, or the specific trajectory of the Bell Beaker expansion in Western Britain, is still being worked out as more ancient DNA data becomes available from sites across the relevant time periods. The question of whether the Anglo-Saxon migration into England was as complete as the genetic data seems to suggest, or whether the high Germanic ancestry fractions in Eastern English populations reflect more complex processes of social stratification and differential reproduction, is actively debated in the technical literature. But none of these ongoing debates changes the fundamental finding that the Welsh and English populations have different genetic profiles that reflect different demographic histories, and that those different histories are themselves a consequence of the different terrains of the two regions and their different relationships to successive waves of migration across the past 12,000 years. The mountains made the difference, the genetics confirm it, and the cultural and linguistic evidence that has been accumulating since the first literate observers began to describe the people of Britain tells the same story in a different register. The responsibility that comes with understanding this story at its full depth is to hold it with both intellectual honesty and genuine humility. The genetic distinctiveness of the Welsh people is not a foundation for ethnic exclusivism or political nationalism. It does not mean that only people of ancient Welsh ancestry are truly Welsh, or that genetic heritage determines cultural identity, or that the boundaries we draw on maps correspond in any simple way to the boundaries that exist in genomes. Populations are not neatly delimited. Genes flow across any boundary humans can draw. The eastern border of Wales has always been a zone of mixing and exchange, and the Welsh gene pool has been continuously shaped by that mixing, even as it preserved more of its ancient inheritance than the English lowland populations to the east. The point is not to draw a sharper line between Welsh and English than nature has drawn, but to understand why a line exists at all, why two populations that have been living alongside each other for at least 1,500 years can still be distinguished in their average genetic profiles, and why that distinction has physical and cultural expressions that observers have been noting for at least 2,000 years. The answer is geography and time, the mountains and the millennia. Those are the real reasons the Welsh look nothing like the English. And now you know the story that explains both. The neuroscience of place attachment has become an increasingly active research area in recent years, and its findings are relevant to the Welsh story in ways that illuminate the psychological dimension of the cultural distinctiveness we have been tracing. When communities live in intimate relationship with a specific landscape across many generations, the relationship is not merely economic or practical. It becomes encoded in memory and identity in ways that have measurable neurological correlates. The hippocampus, the brain region most directly involved in spatial memory and navigation, develops differently in people who have grown up learning a complex landscape intimately versus those who navigate primarily through abstract symbolic systems like maps and GPS. Communities that rely on direct landscape knowledge for navigation and resource location develop a richer and more detailed spatial memory architecture than those who do not. The Welsh pastoral communities that maintained the Hafod and Hondra transhumance tradition for centuries were developing, in each new generation, precisely this kind of rich spatial memory through the practical necessity of knowing their landscape in detail. The knowledge of where particular herbs grew, where the ground was unstable, where the good water sources were, where the weather came from, all of this was encoded in memory through repeated experience across a lifetime and transmitted through education and imitation to the next generation. This kind of deep landscape knowledge is not simply useful information. It is part of the psychological foundation of identity. People who know a place that intimately are bound to it in ways that people without that knowledge are not, and they carry that bond even in diaspora, even when separated from the physical landscape, because the knowledge is internal and was not left behind when they moved. The hiereth of the Welsh diaspora is not a sentimental attachment to an abstract homeland. It is the felt absence of a specific landscape that was known with the intimacy that only many generations of continuous presence can produce. The geological uniqueness of Wales adds a dimension to the story that connects the human history to the deep natural history of the landscape in ways that are rarely appreciated. The name Cambria, the Roman name for Wales, gave its name to an entire geological period. The Cambrian period, spanning from roughly 540 to 485 million years ago, was named after Wales because it was in the rocks of Wales that the distinctive fossil assemblages of that period were first systematically described by the geologist Adam Sedgwick in the 1830s. The ancient rocks that form the core of the Welsh landscape, the Precambrian and Cambrian formations of Snowdonia and the Welsh uplands, are among the oldest exposed rocks in Britain. They were formed in conditions utterly unlike anything that has existed on the surface of the earth for hundreds of millions of years, in deep ocean environments and on volcanic island arcs, and in the thick deposits of material that accumulated along ancient continental margins. When you walk on the summit of Snowdon, you are walking on rocks that formed as limestone in a warm, shallow sea 500 million years ago, and that were subsequently buried, metamorphosed, thrust upward, and exposed by erosion over geological timescales that dwarf anything in human history. The deep time of the Welsh landscape, its geological antiquity, provides a context for the deep time of the human presence in Wales that is worth holding in mind. 12,000 years of continuous human presence is not a long time in geological terms, but it is a very long time in human terms, and the geological permanence of the Welsh landscape provides a stable context within which that human continuity has been possible in a way that more geologically dynamic landscapes cannot always offer. The Red Dragon of Wales, the Ddraig Goch, is one of the most ancient national symbols in Europe. Its origins are debated, but it appears in the Historia Brittonum, attributed to Nennius, in a story that describes a contest between a red dragon and a white dragon beneath the foundations of a tower being built by Vortigern in the period of the Anglo-Saxon invasions. The red dragon represents the Britons, the people who would become the Welsh, and the white dragon represents the Saxons. The story ends, in the prophetic tradition associated with the character of Merlin, with the ultimate triumph of the red dragon over the white. As a myth, it encodes the experience of a people that felt itself embattled and displaced, but maintained the belief in its own ultimate persistence. The dragon has been associated with Wales in various forms since at least the early medieval period, and it appears on the Welsh flag, the only national flag in the world to feature a dragon in the specific form of a red dragon on a green and white background that became standardized in the 20th century, but has medieval antecedents. The choice of a dragon as the national symbol of Wales is itself revealing. The dragon in Welsh tradition, and more broadly in Celtic tradition, is an ancient creature, one of the most primordial beings in the mythological framework. Associating the Welsh people with such a creature is a statement about deep origins, about a people that was there before the historical period, that has roots going back to a time before the categories and the boundaries and the names that most people use to organize their understanding of Britain. That is not a mythological exaggeration. It is, as we have seen, a biological fact. The Welsh people are there, in their genetic profile, in their language, in their landscape knowledge, in proportions that predate the formation of England, that predate the Roman period, that predate the Iron Age, that trace back to the post-glacial period, and the Atlantic coast migrations that established the foundation of the Western European genetic landscape. The dragon is appropriate. It is an ancient creature, and the people it represents are, in the most meaningful biological sense, ancient too. The Welsh concept of Cymru, the name that Welsh speakers use for their country, is itself an expression of the depth and the exclusivity of the Welsh identity in a way that the English word Wales is not. Wales comes from the Old English word Wielas, meaning foreigners or strangers, the term that Anglo-Saxon speakers applied to the Brittonic Celtic peoples they encountered to the west. It is an external label, defining the Welsh in terms of their relationship to the Anglo-Saxon world. Cymru is an internal name, the name by which the Welsh call themselves, and it comes from the Brittonic word for compatriots, or people of the same country. The Cymri, the Welsh people, are the people who share the same land, the same cultural heritage, the same language, the same identity. It is a name that defines the Welsh in terms of their relationship to each other and to their land, not in terms of their relationship to their neighbours. The distinction between these two naming conventions is philosophically significant. It reflects the difference between a self-definition based on deep internal rootedness and an external definition based on apparent strangeness to observers from outside. The Anglo-Saxons called the Welsh foreigners because they were foreign to the Anglo-Saxon world, a different language, a different culture, a different appearance. The Welsh called themselves compatriots because they knew themselves to be deeply rooted in a shared place and a shared heritage. Both names are accurate descriptions of the same reality. The Welsh are foreigners to the English world in the same way that an ancient tree is foreign to a garden that was planted around it after the tree was already there. And the Welsh are compatriots to each other in the way that can only be achieved by communities that have been sharing the same landscape and the same language and the same cultural frameworks for longer than anyone has been writing it down. The archaeological evidence from the medieval period reinforces the picture of Welsh demographic continuity in ways that go beyond the textual record. The distribution of Welsh sites from the early medieval period shows a pattern of continuous occupation in the upland valleys and on the coastal margins that is consistent with a population that had been there before and that continued to inhabit the same ecological zones after the Roman withdrawal and through the Anglo-Saxon period. The ringwork sites, small defended enclosures associated with local Welsh lordships, are distributed across the Welsh landscape in patterns that reflect the territorial organisation of Iron Age and Roman period Wales, suggesting continuity of territorial structure across the transition from Roman to post-Roman to medieval governance. The field system evidence, where it is visible through earthwork surveys and aerial photography and LiDAR analysis, shows similar continuity. The medieval Welsh stripfield systems and enclosed pastoral areas reflect agricultural practices adapted to the specific conditions of the Welsh upland landscape, and they show continuity with earlier patterns of land use that suggests the populations implementing them had inherited their knowledge of the land from predecessors who had been using the same land in similar ways. Continuity in land use and land organisation is one of the best indirect indicators of population continuity, because it implies the transmission of detailed local knowledge from generation to generation, and that transmission is most reliable when it happens within communities that remain in the same place across successive generations. The haplogroup distributions in Welsh populations, when examined at the fine-grained regional level, show patterns that correspond remarkably closely to the historical geography of Welsh linguistic and cultural regions. The Welsh-speaking heartland of Gwynedd and Ceredigion and Western Powys shows the highest frequencies of the ancient lineages, the WHG-associated mitochondrial haplogroups, and the oldest R1b subclades. The more anglicised border communities and the industrialised South Wales valleys show more mixed haplogroup distributions, reflecting the admixture that those communities have experienced from English migration in the historical period. This fine-grained regional correspondence between linguistic geography and genetic geography is one of the most striking findings in the genetics of the British Isles. It suggests that language and genes have moved together, or rather that both language and genes have been most thoroughly preserved in exactly the communities where the deep landscape roots were strongest and where the social and demographic pressures toward Anglicisation were weakest. The mountains of North and West Wales protected both the language and the genes in the same communities and by the same mechanisms. Understanding the regional genetic variation within Wales is as important as understanding the overall difference between Welsh and English populations, because it shows that the genetic story is not uniform across Wales, but is graded in ways that correspond to the known historical geography of the country. The DNA of living Welsh people connects them not only to the ancient past of Britain, but to the wider ancient world of European prehistory in ways that most of them have never considered. When a person from Gwynedd submits a saliva sample to a commercial ancestry testing service, the results they receive will typically show substantial percentages of ancestry attributed to Celtic and British Isles categories, with lower percentages attributed to the Germanic and Scandinavian ancestries that dominate in many English test results. But those commercial categories are simplifications of a far more complex and far more ancient reality. The Celtic ancestry category in commercial tests represents a population layer that formed in the context of the Bell Beaker expansion and the Bronze Age Atlantic Celtic cultural development. The British Isles category represents the even older layers of Neolithic and Mesolithic ancestry that predate the Bell Beaker expansion. But neither of these categories captures the full depth of what a Welsh genome contains, because the deep ancestral layers, the Western hunter-gatherer ancestry that traces back to populations that were in Europe before the last glacial maximum, are not well described by any of the named categories that commercial tests typically use. The ancient European roots of the Welsh people go deeper than any category most people have a name for. They connect to populations that were hunting and gathering across Atlantic Europe before farming had been invented anywhere on the planet. Populations whose way of life and whose relationship to the landscape would be entirely unrecognizable to modern observers, but whose genetic heritage survives measurably and persistently in the genomes of people who are shopping in Cardiff today, or watching sheep from a farmhouse in Ceredigion. The conversation between the past and the present is never simple and never complete, and the genetic story of Wales is no exception. Modern Welsh people are the product of everything that has happened since the post-glacial migrants first arrived in the mountains, including the admixture of the historical period and the social and demographic changes of the industrial era, and the modern connectivity that allows Welsh people to move across and between communities in ways that were not possible for most of human history. The genetic distinctiveness that the research documents is a population-level statistical reality, not a characteristic of every individual Welsh person. There are Welsh people with genetic profiles that would not distinguish them from English populations, and there are English people, particularly in the border counties, with genetic profiles that show substantial ancient British ancestry. The boundaries in the genomes are not sharp lines. They are gradients, zones of transition from one pattern to another, reflecting the reality that populations do not respect political or cultural boundaries in any absolute sense. What the genetics show is that the average, the central tendency, is different on the two sides of the political boundary between Wales and England, and that difference has deep historical roots. Understanding that difference, honestly and without exaggeration, is part of understanding what Britain actually is and how it came to be the complex, layered, multiply-inhabited island that it is today. The story of Wales is the story of what survives, not what was triumphant, not what was powerful in any conventional political or military sense, but what persisted through successive pressures and waves of change while maintaining enough of its essential character to be recognizable across 12,000 years of transformation. The mountains survived the ice and the rain and the millennia of erosion. The people survived the farming expansion and the steppe migration and the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans and the Industrial Revolution and the campaigns to suppress the language and everything else that the history of Luffers, Britain has thrown at the Welsh world. The language survived when every comparable language in lowland Britain was replaced by Latin, and then by Old English, and then by Middle English, and then by the early modern standardized English that eventually became the dominant tongue of an empire. The culture survived, in forms that changed enormously in detail, while maintaining a thread of continuity stretching back to the Iron Age bardic tradition, and beyond it, to whatever preceded that tradition, in the memory of the Atlantic Celtic world. And the genes survived, not unchanged, not pure in any meaningful sense, but with enough of the ancient layers preserved that modern science can look at the genome of a person from a Welsh-speaking farming community and find there echoes of the people who first walked into these mountains when the ice was still retreating and the world was wet and raw and new. That is what it means for the Welsh to look nothing like the English. It means that thousands of years of differential history, shaped by a landscape that preserved what it contained, have produced populations that carry genuinely different genetic heritages in measurably different proportions. And that is a story that deserves to be told in full, with all the complexity and all the depth that the evidence actually supports, rather than reduced to the simple politically charged narratives that usually dominate the conversation about Welsh and English identity. The mountains made the difference, the science confirms it, and the people who live in those mountains, speaking the oldest living language in Britain, carry the proof in their cells every day of their lives. The microbiome research of recent years adds yet another dimension to the distinctiveness of populations shaped by specific landscapes and specific dietary traditions. The gut microbiome, the community of bacteria and other microorganisms that inhabit the human digestive system, is increasingly understood to be shaped by diet, environment, and early life exposure in ways that produce population-level differences that can be as significant as the genetic differences we have been discussing. Welsh pastoral communities, whose traditional diet centered on lamb and mutton and dairy products and oat-based foods and the wild plants of the upland environment, developed microbiome compositions that were adapted to processing those specific foods efficiently. The microbiome of a community is not genetically inherited in the same way that the nuclear genome is, but it is transmitted across generations through the same social mechanisms that transmit language and culture, through shared food, shared environment, shared social contact within the community. And the microbiome, in turn, influences gene expression and immune function and metabolic processes in ways that contribute to the health and physiological characteristics of the population. The traditional diet of the Welsh uplands, with its emphasis on fermented dairy products like cheese and butter, and its extensive use of wild plants, was a microbiome-shaping diet, and the communities that maintained it over generations developed microbiome compositions that were adapted to that diet and that were distinct from the microbiome compositions of communities eating different foods in different environments. When industrial agriculture and processed food diets began replacing traditional diets in Welsh communities during the 20th century, they disrupted not only the economic and cultural patterns of Welsh life, but the microbiome ecology that had been developing in those communities over centuries. The public health consequences of that disruption are still being worked out by researchers, but they form part of the story of how the deep biological distinctiveness of Welsh communities has been challenged and changed by modernity in ways that go beyond the purely genetic or the purely cultural. The relationship between the Welsh landscape and the climate is worth examining in the context of the larger question about why the physical characteristics of Welsh populations are what they are. Wales receives its distinctive climate because of its position on the western edge of the European landmass, in the path of the prevailing westerly winds that carry moisture from the Atlantic. The same oceanic air masses that bring the rain also moderate the temperature, keeping Wales warmer in winter than its latitude might suggest, and cooler in summer than more continental locations at the same latitude. The result is a maritime climate, characteristically wet and overcast, with relatively small seasonal temperature variation. This climate is not hospitable to large-scale arable agriculture in the uplands, which is why Welsh farming has always been predominantly pastoral, but it is excellent climate for certain other things. It is excellent for grass, which grows almost year-round in the mild temperatures and abundant moisture, which is why Wales can support dense sheep populations even on thin upland soils. It is excellent for the kinds of slow biological processes, the accumulation of peat, the growth of ancient woodland on sheltered slopes, the maintenance of biodiversity in habitats that are not subject to the extremes of continental climates, that produce the characteristic ecological richness of Atlantic environments. And it is, crucially, a climate that selects for specific physiological characteristics in the populations that have lived in it for long enough to experience selection pressure. The pale skin and the dark hair of the WHG genetic inheritance are characteristics that make physiological sense in a low UV, high cloud cover environment. Pale skin maximizes vitamin D synthesis in the limited sunlight available. The dark hair, which often accompanies the pale skin in this genetic background, provides some UV protection for the scalp without significantly reducing the UV that reaches the lighter-skinned parts of the body. The physiological logic of the WHG pigmentation profile, which can seem counterintuitive if you think of pale skin as always being associated with light hair, makes sense in the specific environmental context of the Atlantic fringe. The climate shaped the selection pressures. The selection pressures produced the WHG pigmentation profile, and the Welsh landscape preserved that profile by limiting the admixture that brought in different pigmentation genetic configurations elsewhere in Britain. The psychological research on the relationship between landscape familiarity and cognitive performance adds an interesting dimension to the story of Welsh distinctiveness. Communities that have maintained continuous relationships with specific landscapes develop cognitive resources related to that landscape, detailed spatial memory, refined perceptual systems tuned to the specific visual and acoustic and olfactory qualities of the environment, navigational competencies adapted to the specific terrain. These cognitive adaptations are not genetically inherited in the same way as physical characteristics, but they are culturally transmitted and are associated with specific communities and specific places in ways that reinforce the distinctiveness of those communities. A Welsh shepherd navigating the high ground of the Brecon Beacons on a misty day is demonstrating cognitive resources that are developed through training and experience in that specific environment, resources that a person raised in a different environment would not possess and could not quickly acquire. The accumulated cognitive adaptations of Welsh pastoral communities, developed over many generations of living and working in a specific demanding landscape, are part of what makes those communities distinct from others in ways that go beyond the genetic and the cultural and the linguistic to the cognitive and the psychological. These adaptations are not measurable in the same way as the genetic or the physical differences, but they are real, and they contribute to the overall distinctiveness of Welsh communities that has been observed and commented upon across historical periods. The standing stones and megalithic monuments of Wales are among the most visible reminders of the deep human presence in the landscape, and they deserve a place in any account of Welsh distinctiveness because they encode, in stone, the continuity between the ancient and the modern Welsh world. The standing stones of Wales, distributed across the country from the great monuments of Anglesey to the solitary standing stones of the uplands, were erected by populations whose genetic profile would have been intermediate between the Neolithic farming ancestry that arrived with the first farmers and the older WHG ancestry they were absorbing. Those populations have now become, through the long process we have traced, the modern Welsh people, and the stones they erected are still there, in the landscape, providing a physical continuity between the deep past and the present that has no parallel in the more thoroughly disrupted and transformed landscapes of lowland England. When a Welsh farmer tends sheep on a hillside that contains a 3,000-year-old standing stone, the continuity between past and present is not merely metaphorical. It is the same people, in the same place, with different tools and a different language, but with the same deep genetic roots and the same relationship to the same landscape that stone was part of when it was first erected. The stone is a fixed point in a landscape of continuous human presence, and the people who look at it today are, in a very real biological sense, the descendants of the people who put it there. The question of what Wales will be like genetically and culturally in another 100 or 200 years is impossible to answer with confidence, but the trajectory of the past few decades offers some indication. The Welsh language revitalisation movement has produced more Welsh speakers in some age cohorts than existed in the previous generation. The growth of Welsh medium education has created Welsh speakers in communities and families that were not Welsh-speaking, expanding the linguistic community even as some traditional Welsh-speaking communities have been diluted by in-migration. The population movements of the late 20th and early 21st centuries have brought significant numbers of people from outside Wales into the country, particularly into the coastal areas and the university towns and the commuter zones of the Cardiff capital region. These population movements are introducing new genetic diversity into the Welsh gene pool and changing the linguistic and cultural composition of some Welsh communities. The outcome of these processes, whether they will ultimately dilute the distinctive Welsh genetic heritage or whether the Welsh cultural tradition will prove robust enough to absorb new members while maintaining its core character, is not yet determined. What we can say with confidence is that the Welsh genetic heritage that we have traced through 12,000 years of history has proved extraordinarily resilient in the face of previous challenges that were, in some respects, far more severe than anything the modern period has produced. If that resilience has anything to teach us about the future, it suggests that the mountains will continue to do what they have always done, to protect and preserve what is specifically Welsh, in ways that the more accessible parts of Britain cannot match. The rain will continue to fall. The language will continue to be spoken in the communities where it has always been spoken. And the genes will continue to carry the message from the deep past that no subsequent history has been able to fully overwrite. Wales endures. It endures because it is rooted in a landscape that made its people what they are and that has been preserving them in all their distinctiveness for longer than most of the world's nations have existed. The final piece of this story is perhaps the most important, and it is the piece that connects everything we have discussed to the simple observation that prompted the question in the first place. Someone looks at a Welsh face and sees something different from an English face, something they cannot immediately articulate, but that is nonetheless real and consistent enough to be noticed. What they are seeing, whether they know it or not, is the accumulated genetic heritage of 12,000 years of differential demographic history playing out in the physical characteristics of a living person. They are seeing the pigmentation genetics of the Western hunter-gatherers, preserved at higher frequencies in Wales than in England because the Welsh mountains limited the admixture that diluted those genetics elsewhere. They are seeing the cranial and facial morphology that reflects the particular combination of Neolithic, Bronze Age, and Mesolithic ancestry, present in proportions that are different from those in English lowland populations. They are seeing the skin quality, and the hair colour, and the eye colour that emerge from a genetic profile that is, on average and in statistical terms, genuinely distinct from the profile of the English population in ways that go all the way back to the post-glacial period. They are not imagining the difference. The difference is real, it is genetic, it is historical, it is rooted in the most fundamental processes of human population genetics, in migration and terrain and differential admixture, and the long-term consequences of geography on the composition of gene pools. And now, if you have been listening to this story from its beginning, you know why. You know the mountains and the rain and the retreating ice and the post-glacial migrants and the Western hunter-gatherers and the Neolithic farmers and the Bell Beaker expansion and the Anglo-Saxons and all the other chapters of the story that produced the difference that people notice in Welsh faces and that most people cannot explain. The real reason the Welsh look nothing like the English is that they are, in the deepest and most literal biological sense, a different ancient people, not alien, not better or worse, but genuinely, measurably, fascinatingly distinct. And the story of how they became distinct is the story of this island over the longest timescale that science can now reliably trace. The concept of genetic drift, the random fluctuation in gene frequencies that occurs in small populations simply by chance, is relevant to the Welsh story in a way that adds statistical depth to the historical account we have been developing. When a population is small and relatively isolated, as the Welsh upland communities often were during the pre-industrial period, random events can have larger effects on the gene pool than they would in larger, more connected populations. A particularly severe winter, an epidemic disease outbreak, a famine, or simply the chance that certain families had more surviving children than others, all of these random events can shift the frequencies of particular genetic variants in a small population in ways that accumulate over generations into measurable differences from neighbouring populations. The cumulative effect of genetic drift over the thousands of years that Welsh upland communities have been relatively isolated from the surrounding genetic landscape has contributed to the distinctiveness we observe in ways that supplement the historical events we have been discussing. Some of the specific features of the Welsh genetic profile that distinguish it most sharply from the English one may be the result of drift as much as of selection or historical migration patterns. The elevated AH-negative frequency in Wales, for instance, may partly reflect random fluctuation in small, isolated communities, rather than any specific selective advantage of AH-negative blood in the Welsh environment. The specific combination of ancient haplogroup frequencies in particular Welsh valleys may reflect the founding population of those valleys and the subsequent drift of that founding gene pool more than any ongoing selection. These drift effects are real contributions to Welsh genetic distinctiveness, and they are consequences of the same isolation and small population structure that produced the historically documented distinctiveness through the more straightforward mechanisms we have discussed. The tradition of Welsh medicine, the physicians of Midfai, represents one of the most remarkable and most poorly publicized bodies of traditional medical knowledge in Europe. The physicians of Midfai were a hereditary family of physicians associated with the village of Midfai in Carmarthenshire, who maintained a medical tradition that was documented in manuscripts from the 13th century onward, and that drew on both classical learned medicine and a deep tradition of Welsh plant law and empirical observation. The medical texts associated with the Midfai physicians contain hundreds of herbal remedies and treatments that reflect the botanical knowledge of Welsh pastoral communities accumulated over centuries or millennia. The identification of specific plants as having specific medicinal properties, the preparation methods for making those plants effective, the dosage guidance, all of this represents the kind of accumulated empirical knowledge that can only be built up through generations of observation and experimentation by communities living in intimate relationship with a specific plant ecology. The fact that this tradition was maintained in a coherent and transmissible form through the medieval period and into the early modern period, when it was eventually transcribed into manuscript form, is itself evidence of the cultural continuity of Welsh communities. You cannot maintain a complex medical tradition across generations without the institutional and social frameworks that allow knowledge to be transmitted accurately over time, and those frameworks were present in Wales in the form of hereditary professional families and the bardic and monastic educational institutions that supported them. The Midfi tradition is the medical dimension of the same deep cultural continuity that the genetics document in the biological dimension and that the bardic tradition documents in the literary dimension. The Welsh tradition of canu penilion, the practice of singing counter-melodies above or below a harp accompaniment that is itself playing a traditional tune, is one of the most technically demanding and most distinctive musical practices in the folk music tradition of any European people. It requires the singer to maintain an independent melodic line in a different rhythm from the harp accompaniment, while remaining harmonically related to it, listening to the harp melody while producing a different one simultaneously. This is cognitively demanding in ways that have been studied by music psychologists, and it represents a form of musical practice that has no close parallel in the folk traditions of other European peoples. The tradition traces back to the medieval bardic tradition of performing poetry to harp accompaniment, and its survival in Wales as a living practice, maintained through the Eisteddfod tradition and through community transmission in Welsh-speaking communities, is evidence of the same extraordinary cultural continuity we have been tracing. No other European folk music tradition has maintained such an unbroken connection to its medieval roots, while continuing to be practiced as a living art form by ordinary community members rather than specialist scholars or revivalists. The canu penilion tradition requires a deep knowledge of the Welsh melodic repertoire, an intimate familiarity with the harmonic and rhythmic conventions of the tradition, and the cognitive capacity to maintain independent musical lines simultaneously. All of these requirements are products of long training within a living tradition, and they have been maintained in Welsh communities where the tradition was never completely broken by the pressures of modernization. The tradition is not merely surviving in Wales, it is developing, with new penilion being composed and new performers emerging from the communities that have maintained the tradition continuously. The geopolitical position of Wales in the context of the British Isles is worth considering from the perspective of migration dynamics, because it helps explain why Wales received different populations of migrants and in different proportions than England throughout the historical period. England, particularly the eastern and southern parts, was far more accessible to migration from the European continent than Wales. The North Sea and the English Channel, while genuine water barriers, were regularly crossed by seafarers in both directions from the Neolithic period onward, and the fertile lowlands of eastern England provided an attractive destination for settlers from the continental European populations that periodically expanded their ranges westward or northward. Wales, by contrast, was accessible from the sea, primarily from the Irish Sea to the west and from the Bristol Channel to the south, and the Atlantic-facing coasts of Wales were connected to the Atlantic world rather than to the continental European world that produced most of the major migrations into Britain. The Irish Sea connections brought Welsh communities into contact with Irish populations, which is reflected in the historical period by the Irish settlements in parts of Wales during the early medieval period, and by the long-standing cultural connections between the Western Welsh kingdoms and the Irish political world. But Irish migration into Wales in the historical period was not a demographic replacement event of the kind that the Anglo-Saxon migration produced in England. It was more like the kind of mixing that had been occurring between Atlantic Celtic communities for millennia, reinforcing the shared Atlantic Celtic genetic heritage rather than introducing something fundamentally different. The directional specificity of the migration routes accessible to Wales versus England is thus another factor that contributed to the different genetic histories of the two populations, reinforcing the role of terrain in shaping the demographic outcomes. The Arthurian cycle, that vast network of stories that grew from the Welsh tradition into one of the most widely known mythological frameworks in the world, is worth revisiting in the context of everything we have discussed, because it represents perhaps the most globally impactful product of the deep Welsh cultural tradition. The stories originated in the Brittonic Celtic world of post-Roman Britain, in the communities whose language and culture and genetic heritage would eventually become Welsh. They were carried in the Welsh bardic tradition through the early medieval period, refined and elaborated by Welsh storytellers who were working within the cultural framework of a people that understood itself to be the inheritor of the ancient British legacy. When those stories were picked up by continental writers in the 12th and 13th centuries, first by Geoffrey of Monmouth in his largely fictional but enormously influential Historia Regum Britanniae, and then by the French romancers who transformed the Arthurian material into the elaborate chivalric narratives we know today, they were drawing on a cultural product of the Welsh tradition and translating it into a different register for different audiences. The stories lost much of their specifically Welsh character in this process of translation and elaboration. The landscape becomes generic, the cultural context becomes feudal and courtly rather than Celtic and pastoral, and the specific Welsh connections are obscured by the pan-European framework of medieval romance. But the stories ultimately trace back to Welsh storytellers, to the bardic tradition of people whose genetic heritage we have now traced through 12,000 years of continuous presence in the mountains of Western Britain. When Malory writes about Arthur in the 15th century, or when Tennyson writes about him in the 19th century, or when Hollywood makes films about him in the 20th and 21st centuries, they are all drawing on cultural material that originated in Wales, in communities whose distinctiveness we have now measured at the molecular level. The global reach of the Arthurian legend is, among many other things, a measure of the cultural productivity of a people whose remarkable deep history is only now beginning to be understood in its full biological depth. The water of Wales, the rivers and lakes and springs and bogs and ocean inlets that give the country its characteristic wet landscape, is itself a kind of archive of the human presence. Rivers have been central to Welsh settlement patterns from the earliest human occupation. The valleys cut by the rivers of Wales provided the most habitable terrain in an otherwise mountainous landscape, and the settlements that established themselves in those valleys have been in place, in some cases, for longer than the written record can confirm. The river names of Wales are among the oldest place names in Britain: the Severn, the Wye, the Teifi, the Dee, the Conwy, the Tywey. These names come from linguistic strata that predate the historical period, and in some cases may predate the Celtic languages that gave them the forms we know. The river names are a linguistic archaeology. Preserving in the place name record the memory of languages spoken by people who have been dead for thousands of years, but whose genetic heritage, as we have seen, continues to circulate in the gene pool of the living. When a Welsh speaker uses the ancient name of a river that flows through their valley, they are speaking a word that has been in continuous use in that place for longer than any other word in the local vocabulary, a word that connects the present moment to the deep past of European prehistory in the most direct and intimate way possible. The word for the river is the oldest thing they will say that day, and the fact that they are there to say it is itself the product of the 12,000-year story we have been telling. The bees of Wales, and the ancient tradition of beekeeping that has been practiced in Welsh communities since at least the Iron Age, are a small but telling detail in the larger picture. The Welsh laws of Hywel Dda contain detailed provisions about the legal status of bees and the obligations of beekeepers, reflecting the economic importance of bees in the Welsh pastoral economy as providers of wax and honey in a world without sugar, and with limited alternatives to beeswax for lighting and other purposes. The Welsh word for bee, gwenyn, and the words for honey, mel, and mead, med, the honey-fermented drink that was central to the feasting culture of Celtic aristocratic society, are ancient words with cognates in other Celtic languages and in other Indo-European languages, reflecting the great antiquity of the human relationship with bees in Europe. The tradition of beekeeping in Wales was maintained continuously through the medieval and early modern periods, and it connected Welsh agricultural communities to a practice that had been part of European human life since at least the Neolithic period and probably before. The bees themselves, the Welsh black bee and related strains adapted to the wet Atlantic climate, are part of the ecological distinctiveness of the Welsh landscape, themselves products of thousands of years of adaptation to the specific conditions of the Atlantic fringe. In this way, even the insects of Wales are part of the story of deep continuity and specific local adaptation that we have been tracing through the genetics and the history and the culture. What does it all add up to, in the end? 12,000 years of human presence in a specific, demanding landscape. Multiple waves of migration absorbed differently than they were absorbed elsewhere, each wave adding its contribution without overwhelming what was already there. A genetic profile that preserves higher proportions of ancient ancestry layers than almost any comparable population in Britain. Physical characteristics that express from that genetic profile in measurably different ways than the characteristics that express from the English gene pool. A language that survived when all comparable languages in lowland Britain were replaced, maintained in the communities that were rooted most deeply in their landscape. A cultural tradition that transformed in form across the centuries while maintaining a thread of continuity stretching back to the Iron Age and beyond. A sense of identity rooted in place rather than in political category, in the shared inheritance of a landscape that gave the people who inhabited it the specific qualities that distinguished them from their neighbours. The mountains made Wales. The mountains shaped the Welsh. And the mountains, as they have always done, continue to protect what is there, allowing it to persist and develop in its own way, different from what surrounds it, specific to its place, ancient in its roots, and still alive in all the ways that matter, in the language that still describes the landscape in words older than any other language in Britain, in the genes that still carry echoes of the people who first walked into these mountains when the world was new, and in the faces of living people who look, to anyone paying attention, like no one else on the island. The modern genomic era has produced tools for studying population history that were unimaginable to previous generations of researchers, and those tools are continuing to refine our understanding of the Welsh story in ways that are adding detail without substantially changing the broad picture we have traced. Whole genome sequencing of ancient individuals from Welsh archaeological sites is proceeding as samples become available, and as the laboratory technology for extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from challenging preservation contexts improves. Each new ancient genome from a Welsh site adds a data point that allows researchers to calibrate the trajectory of genetic change across time in this specific landscape, and the picture that is emerging is consistent with what the modern genome data predicted. The ancient Welsh populations of the Bronze Age and Iron Age show genetic profiles that are intermediate between the modern Welsh and the ancient Neolithic and Mesolithic populations, precisely as the demographic model predicts. The continuity between ancient and modern Welsh populations, particularly in the genomic regions most strongly associated with the WHG ancestry component, is among the most striking examples of population continuity documented anywhere in the British Isles. Researchers working on the British ancient DNA dataset have noted that the Welsh samples show less genetic change between the Bronze Age and the present than comparable samples from Eastern England show across the same time period. The mountains preserved the gene pool across 3,000 years of Bronze Age, Iron Age, Roman, and early medieval history in ways that the lowland terrain did not, and the modern genome data from Welsh populations is the living record of that preservation. The political dimension of the Welsh genetic story is one that requires careful navigation but cannot be entirely avoided in a complete account. The existence of a measurable genetic difference between Welsh and English populations is a fact that has been and will continue to be politicized by people on various sides of the debate about Welsh national identity and independence. Some Welsh nationalists have pointed to the genetic evidence as confirmation of the deep biological roots of Welsh identity. Some opponents of Welsh language and cultural policy have attempted to use genetic data to argue about who counts as genuinely Welsh and who does not. Both of these uses of the genetic evidence are problematic. The genetic data tells us about the demographic history of populations, not about the political rights or cultural authenticity of individuals. A person who has no Welsh genetic ancestry, but who speaks Welsh and is embedded in Welsh community life, is Welsh in every meaningful cultural and political sense. A person who has deep Welsh genetic ancestry, but who was raised without the language or the culture, is not necessarily Welsh in the cultural sense, whatever their biology. The genetic distinctiveness of the Welsh population is a historical fact with interesting scientific implications. It is not a foundation for exclusionary identity politics or for any claim that Welsh identity can be reduced to or determined by genetic heritage. The scientists who produce this research are generally careful to make this point explicitly, and it bears repeating in any account that draws on their work. The lesson that the Welsh story offers to anyone paying attention is not about ethnic identity in the political sense. It is about the relationship between people and place, and about what that relationship produces over the long term. When communities are allowed to remain in their landscapes across many generations, maintaining their cultural frameworks and their language and their local knowledge, they develop a depth of relationship with that place that produces both the genetic distinctiveness we have measured and the cultural richness we have described. When communities are disrupted and displaced and forced into new relationships with unfamiliar places, that depth is lost, and with it go the cultural products, the languages and the medical traditions and the ecological knowledge and the literary traditions that the depth made possible. The Welsh story is evidence that this depth of relationship is achievable and maintainable over very long timescales if the conditions are right. The conditions in Wales were right, imperfectly and intermittently, because the mountains provided a degree of protection against the disruptions that prevented its accumulation elsewhere. The story does not have a simple political moral. It does not tell us that isolation is good, or that admixture is bad, or that any political arrangement is preferable to any other. It tells us that the relationship between communities and places is consequential and that its consequences extend across timescales much longer than we usually consider when making decisions about those relationships. That is worth knowing. It is worth holding in mind when thinking about how communities should be treated and what is at stake when the conditions that allowed the Welsh story to unfold are disrupted or threatened. The Eryri, the area known in English as Snowdonia, is perhaps the most complete expression of everything we have been discussing. A landscape of extraordinary geological antiquity and extraordinary ecological richness, where human presence has been continuous since the post-glacial period, and where the Welsh language and culture are most deeply rooted. The Eryri National Park, established in 1951, contains some of the most spectacular mountain scenery in Britain, with peaks rising to over 1,000 meters and glacially carved valleys dropping steeply to the sea. The biodiversity of the area reflects the full richness of the Atlantic-oceanic climate, with plant communities on the highest slopes that have been there since the tundra conditions of the immediate post-glacial period and that have been maintaining themselves in the same locations for 10,000 years. The human presence in this landscape traces back to the earliest post-glacial period, with evidence of hunter-gatherer activity on the lake margins and in the lower valleys from the 9th millennium BCE. The communities that established themselves here during the Neolithic and Bronze Age left monuments, standing stones and burial chambers and field systems that are still visible in the landscape and that represent the physical expression of the same ancient human presence that the DNA evidence documents in the biological record. The people who live in Eryri today and who speak Welsh as their first language are the most direct inheritors of the full depth of the Welsh story we have been telling. Their genetic profiles show the highest WHG ancestry frequencies in Wales. Their language preserves the oldest vocabulary and the oldest grammatical structures of the Welsh tradition. Their knowledge of the landscape, encoded in the place names they use every day and in the agricultural and ecological practices they maintain, represents the accumulated heritage of a continuous human presence stretching back to the beginning of the post-glacial period. Eryri is not a museum. It is a living community, engaged with the present and facing the future, that also happens to carry in its people and its landscape the deepest and most continuous record of human presence in the British Isles. Understanding it in that way, as both a living community and a living archive, is understanding Wales in the fullest sense. The word that ends this story is the same word that should have been at the beginning and that has been present throughout without always being named explicitly. That word is continuity. The Welsh story is a story about continuity, about what survives when the conditions are right for survival, about the depth of relationship between people and place that accumulates when communities are allowed to persist in their landscapes across the kind of timescales that most people never consider. The genetic continuity, the linguistic continuity, the cultural continuity, the ecological continuity of the relationship between the Welsh people and their specific mountains and valleys and rivers, all of these forms of continuity reinforce each other and are reinforced by the landscape that made them possible. The mountains are still there, the rain still falls, the language is still spoken, the genes still carry their ancient message. And the people who look out from behind the faces that observers have been noting for 2,000 years, the faces that look nothing like the English, are the product of all of it, of every generation that maintained the relationship with this specific place across 12,000 years of history. That is the real reason the Welsh look nothing like the English. It is because they are nothing like the English, in the most literal and most ancient biological sense. And now you know why. The final question worth asking, as we reach the end of this long journey through genetics and geology and history and language and culture, is what it means to carry this knowledge forward. The story of the Welsh people and their deep biological distinctiveness from the English is not a story that ends with the past. It is a story that is still being written in the genomes of children being born in Welsh-speaking communities today, and in the decisions being made about language policy and land management and cultural investment that will determine whether the conditions for continuity persist into the future. The mountains will remain. They are not going anywhere on any timescale that matters to human communities. But the communities that have found within those mountains the conditions for the kind of deep-rooted persistence we have traced are subject to the same pressures that have disrupted communities elsewhere: economic pressures that draw people away from rural landscapes, cultural pressures from the dominant English language media environment, demographic pressures from migration and admixture, and the social changes of modernity. The Welsh language revitalisation effort is the most visible response to those pressures in the cultural domain, and its relative success over the past generation demonstrates that conscious community effort can make a genuine difference to the conditions for cultural continuity. The genetic continuity will take care of itself in the communities that maintain the cultural and social conditions for it, because genetic continuity in a small population is primarily a function of the social patterns that determine who marries whom and how many children survive and how mobile the population is. Cultural continuity and genetic continuity are connected, not because they are the same thing, but because the social conditions that support one tend to support the other. The Welsh language is, in this sense, not only a cultural treasure in its own right, but also a social institution that has, across its history, functioned as a mechanism for maintaining the coherence of Welsh communities in ways that have had both cultural and demographic consequences. Preserving it is not only about preserving a language, it is about preserving the conditions that have made the Welsh story possible across 12,000 years of continuous human presence in one of the oldest and most beautiful landscapes in Britain. The story we have told is ultimately a story of time, of what time does when communities are allowed to remain in their places and maintain their relationships with their landscapes and their neighbours and their accumulated knowledge. Time, in the Welsh case, has produced something genuinely extraordinary. A population that carries in its genome the echoes of the first humans to walk in these mountains after the ice retreated. A language that has been spoken in a recognizable form in this landscape for longer than almost any other language has been spoken anywhere. A cultural tradition that has been developing and refining itself in response to the specific demands and gifts of this specific place for a period that dwarfs the existence of most of the world's nations and institutions. And a people who look, to anyone with eyes to see it, like exactly what they are. The oldest inhabitants of Britain, shaped by the oldest inhabited landscape, carrying the deepest roots of any population on the island. That is what the Welsh are. That is why they look nothing like the English. And that is the story that the mountains have been keeping, quietly and patiently, for 12,000 years. The research teams working on British population genomics have noted something that rarely appears in the abstracts and summaries, but that emerges when you read the full papers carefully. The Welsh samples consistently sit apart from English samples in the principal component analyses that visualize genetic variation across populations. They cluster with other Atlantic fringe populations in a way that confirms the connections we have discussed: the Irish connection, the Scottish Highland connection, the Breton connection. All of these populations sitting in a distinct cloud in the genetic space that separates them from the Central and Eastern English populations. The separation is not absolute. There is overlap, reflecting the admixture and the continuous genetic exchange that has occurred along the borders throughout history. But the central tendency, the typical position of a Welsh genome in that genetic space, is genuinely distinct from the typical position of an English genome, and the distance between them corresponds to the magnitude of the historical demographic differences we have been tracing. This statistical picture confirms everything the historical analysis suggests. The Welsh and the English are genetically distinguishable populations, and they are distinguishable for reasons that have been accumulating since the post-glacial period through a series of historical differences in how migration affected their respective gene pools. The science confirms the intuition. The observation that prompted the question at the beginning of this account, that something looks different about the Welsh, is not an illusion or a prejudice or a product of nationalist wishful thinking. It is a real biological signal, rooted in real historical differences, traceable through the finest-grained molecular evidence that modern science can produce. The mountains made the people made the culture. And the culture, encoded in language and tradition, and the accumulated knowledge of 12,000 years of continuous presence in the most ancient landscape in Britain, is what distinguishes Wales from everything else on this island and from most other places on this earth. There is a phrase in Welsh that captures something essential about this whole story. The phrase is, Hen wad fy en Hadaw, the land of my fathers, and it opens the Welsh national anthem, composed in 1856 but drawing on sentiments far older. In a genetic and historical sense, the phrase is literally accurate. The land of Wales, the mountains and valleys and rivers and coasts, is the context within which the Welsh genetic heritage was shaped and preserved. The connection between the land and the people, between the specific landscape and the specific gene pool and the culture that developed within it, is the core of the Welsh story. Hen wed fwy Nador, old in the geological sense and the genetic sense and the linguistic sense, old in every sense that matters for understanding what Wales is and why the Welsh are who they are. The mountains hold the story. The people carry it. The mountains made the Welsh. Time confirmed it. Science can now prove it. They are the inheritors of the oldest inhabited landscape in Britain, and the mountains that shaped them are still there, still doing what they have always.